Arctic shadows. The MS Aurora Borealis cut through the dark waters of the Greenland Sea like a steel knife through black silk, her hull gleaming white against the pewter-colored swells that rolled beneath an overcast sky. It was June 5th, 2025, and the luxury expedition cruise ship carried 847 passengers and 312 crew members on what the marketing brochures had promised would be the adventure of a lifetime through the pristine wilderness of Svalbard's archipelago. None of them could have imagined that before the day ended, they would witness an event so horrific that it would haunt their dreams for decades to come. Dr. Jonathan Marcus Price stood at the forward observation deck on Deck 7, his weathered hands gripping a professional-grade Canon EOS R5 camera with a 600mm telephoto lens. At 49 years old, Jonathan was a distinguished wildlife photographer whose work had graced the covers of National Geographic, Outside Magazine, and countless conservation publications. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and his deep-set hazel eyes held the focused intensity of a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades chasing the perfect shot in some of the world's most remote locations. He wore a bright red Patagonia expedition parka over layers of merino wool, his feet planted firmly in insulated sorrel boots that had carried him across glaciers from Alaska to Antarctica. "The light's going to be perfect in about 20 minutes, Jonathan murmured to his expedition partner, Dr. Sarah Chen, a marine biologist from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, who had joined him on this particular journey to document the effects of climate change on Arctic wildlife. Sarah, 38 years old with long black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, nodded as she adjusted the settings on her underwater housing camera system. Her petite frame was bundled in a mustard yellow expedition suit, and her dark eyes sparkled with the enthusiasm of someone who had dreamed of visiting these waters since childhood. "Look at those ice formations," Sarah breathed, pointing toward a collection of towering icebergs that rose from the water like ancient cathedrals made of compressed snow and time. "Some of those bergs have to be at least 10,000 years old. Can you imagine the history locked in that ice?" The ship's position was approximately 78 degrees, 55 minutes north, 11 degrees, 56 minutes east, roughly 12 nautical miles northeast of Ny-Ålesund, the world's northernmost research settlement. Captain Erik Haugen, a 55-year-old Norwegian with 30 years of Arctic navigation experience, had positioned the Aurora Borealis in a sheltered bay between 2 significant ice formations to allow passengers optimal viewing and photography opportunities. The water temperature hovered at a bone-chilling 29 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing, while the air temperature registered a relatively mild 34 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds from the northwest at 15 knots. The passenger manifest for this particular voyage read like a who's who of adventure tourism. Wealthy retirees from California seeking bucket list experiences, professional photographers documenting the changing Arctic landscape, scientists conducting research, and thrill seekers drawn by the promise of encountering polar bears in their natural habitat. Among them was Margaret Maggie O'Brien, a 62-year-old retired teacher from Dublin who had saved for 15 years to afford this trip, her late husband's dream that she was fulfilling in his memory. There was also Dr. Andreas Müller, a German glaciologist whose research on ice sheet dynamics had brought him to the Arctic 17 times, and Jennifer Park, a 28-year-old travel blogger whose Instagram account had over 2 million followers, eager to see her Arctic adventure unfold in real time. But it was Dr. Rebecca Thorne, the ship's expedition leader and a world-renowned Arctic wildlife expert, who first spotted the massive polar bear through her binoculars as it emerged from behind a pressure ridge approximately 800 meters from the ship. Rebecca, 43 years old with silver-streaked auburn hair and piercing blue eyes, had led over 200 Arctic expeditions during her career and had encountered polar bears countless times. Yet something about this particular bear immediately set her on edge. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rebecca's voice crackled over the ship's public address system, her British accent crisp and authoritative. "We have a magnificent polar bear sighting off the starboard bow at approximately 800 meters. This appears to be a large adult male, probably weighing between 800 and 1,000 pounds. Please remember to maintain quiet voices and avoid sudden movements that might startle the animal." The bear that had captured everyone's attention was indeed massive. At approximately 10 feet long from nose to tail and standing nearly 5 feet at the shoulder, this was clearly a mature boar in his prime. His fur appeared pristine white against the blue-tinted ice, though seasoned Arctic observers could detect the subtle yellowish tinge that developed on older bears from the natural oils in their coat. His black nose twitched constantly as he tested the air, and his small, dark eyes scanned the surrounding area with the calculated patience of a supreme predator. Jonathan immediately raised his camera, the heavy telephoto lens requiring both hands to steady as he focused on the magnificent creature. Through his viewfinder, he could see details that were invisible to the naked eye. The way the bear's massive paws, each the size of a dinner plate, found perfect purchase on the uneven ice surface, the powerful muscles rippling beneath his thick coat as he moved with surprising grace for such a massive animal. The almost hypnotic way his head swayed back and forth as he analyzed scents carried on the Arctic wind. "God, he's beautiful," whispered Dr. Chen, raising her own camera to capture video footage of the encounter. "Look at the size of those shoulders. He's probably been feeding well on seals this season." The bear appeared to be hunting, moving methodically along the ice edge where seals would typically surface to breathe through natural holes or create breathing spaces in thinner ice. His behavior followed classic polar bear hunting patterns. Periods of motionless waiting, punctuated by careful repositioning as he searched for the telltale signs of seal activity beneath the surface. For the passengers aboard the Aurora Borealis, this was exactly the kind of authentic wildlife encounter they had paid premium prices to witness. Dr. Müller, the German glaciologist, stood near the port rail with his own professional equipment, having pivoted from ice documentation to wildlife photography the moment the bear appeared. "In all my years in the Arctic," he commented to a small group of passengers gathered around him, "I've never seen a bear this close to a cruise ship that remained so focused on hunting rather than investigating the vessel. Most bears show some curiosity about human presence, but this one seems completely absorbed in his natural behavior." The observation was astute and would prove prophetic in ways none of them could anticipate. What Dr. Müller was witnessing was not typical polar bear behavior around large vessels. Most bears, particularly in areas with regular ship traffic like the waters around Svalbard, showed some degree of habituation to human presence. They might watch vessels with mild curiosity, sometimes even approaching close enough to trigger safety protocols that required ships to maintain specific distances. But this bear exhibited an unusual combination of focus and apparent indifference to the massive ship positioned less than a kilometer away. Meanwhile, in the ship's bridge, Captain Haugen was monitoring both the bear's position and the ever-changing ice conditions through a combination of radar, GPS tracking, and direct visual observation. The bridge crew included First Officer Lars Anderson, a 34-year-old Dane who had worked Arctic routes for 8 years, and Navigation Officer Svetlana Petrov, a 41-year-old Russian whose expertise in ice navigation was considered among the best in the industry. The bridge also housed sophisticated communication equipment maintaining constant contact with the Norwegian Coast Guard, the Svalbard Governor's Office, and the Arctic Research Station at Ny-Ålesund. "Ice conditions are stable for the next several hours," reported Officer Petrov, her accent adding a melodic quality to the technical report. Current is pushing the main pack ice northwest at approximately 0.3 knots. Water temperature holding steady at -1.7 degrees Celsius. No weather warnings in effect, though the forecast shows potential for fog development after 1800 hours. Captain Haugen nodded, his experienced eyes constantly scanning between the ship's instruments and the scene unfolding on the ice. The Aurora Borealis was equipped with dynamic positioning systems that allowed her to maintain exact position without dropping anchor, crucial when operating in ice-filled waters where traditional anchoring was either impossible or potentially dangerous. The ship's ice-strengthened hull and powerful bow thrusters could handle significant ice contact, but prudent seamanship meant avoiding unnecessary risks. "Maintain current position," Captain Haugen instructed. "Continue monitoring bear movement and be prepared to adjust position if the animal approaches closer than 500 meters. Dr. Thorne, please advise passengers that we'll maintain observation distance for the safety of both wildlife and guests." Down on Deck 7, the passenger excitement was building as word of the polar bear sighting spread throughout the ship. The forward observation lounge, normally a quiet space for reading and casual conversation, had transformed into an impromptu wildlife viewing theatre. Large windows provided panoramic views of the ice field, while outdoor observation decks allowed those brave enough to face the Arctic wind to capture photographs and video footage. Among the gathering crowd was Father Michael Kowalski, a 67-year-old Catholic priest from Chicago who had joined the expedition as part of a sabbatical year dedicated to experiencing God's creation in the world's most remote places. His silver hair was covered by a knitted watch cap, and his kind brown eyes reflected a deep appreciation for the natural world that had drawn him to serve in various wilderness ministries throughout his career. Standing beside him was Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese anthropologist studying the intersection of indigenous cultures and climate change, whose work had brought her to the Arctic numerous times to document traditional Inuit knowledge about ice conditions and animal behavior. "In my grandmother's stories," Dr. Tanaka shared with the small group that had gathered around Father Kowalski, "polar bears were considered the spirits of the ice, creatures that existed between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors. They commanded respect not just for their physical power, but for their spiritual significance in the balance of Arctic life." The conversation was interrupted by an announcement from Dr. Thorne over the ship's communication system. "Ladies and gentlemen, our polar bear friend appears to be moving closer to the water's edge. This is excellent viewing, but I want to remind everyone that polar bears are capable swimmers and have been known to swim distances of over 400 miles in open water. While extremely unlikely, it's theoretically possible for a bear to approach the ship, so please remain calm and follow any instructions from the crew." Jonathan Price had moved to the ship's starboard side, seeking the optimal angle for photography as the late afternoon sun created dramatic lighting conditions across the ice field. The Arctic summer light was unique in its quality, filtered through ice crystals and water vapor to create an almost ethereal glow that made colors appear more saturated and shadows more dramatic. Through his telephoto lens, Jonathan could see that the bear had indeed moved closer to the water's edge, now positioned approximately 600 meters from the ship. "Sarah, are you getting this?" Jonathan called to Dr. Chen, who was documenting the encounter with both still photography and video equipment. "The way he's testing the water temperature with his paw, that's incredibly unusual behavior for a hunting bear. They typically enter the water with much more confidence when pursuing seals." Dr. Chen lowered her camera and frowned slightly. "You're right. And look at his body language. He keeps glancing in our direction, but not with the curiosity I'd expect. It's almost like he's calculating something." Their observation was prescient. The polar bear was indeed calculating, but not in the way either scientist anticipated. What they were witnessing was a rare example of polar bear problem-solving behavior, a cognitive process that researchers were only beginning to understand. The bear had identified the large white object in the water as something that might provide access to new hunting territory or food sources. Unlike the typical seal hunting behavior they expected to observe, this bear was evaluating the ship as a potential resource. The first indication that something unusual was developing came when the bear suddenly stood on his hind legs, reaching his full height of nearly 8 feet, and began testing the air with obvious intensity. His massive head turned slowly from side to side, and his black nose worked constantly as he processed scents carried on the wind. From the ship, passengers could see his enormous front paws, each equipped with claws that could reach 4 inches in length, hanging at his sides as he maintained his upright position for nearly 3 minutes. "That's extraordinary," murmured Dr. Mueller, adjusting his camera settings to capture the bear's impressive display. "I've seen bears stand briefly to get a better view, but this extended positioning suggests he's detected something very specific." What the bear had detected were the cooking aromas from the ship's galley, where executive chef Pierre Dubois and his team were preparing dinner for 847 passengers and 312 crew members. The industrial-scale cooking operation required massive quantities of food, and the ventilation systems necessary to remove cooking odors and steam were inadvertently broadcasting an olfactory advertisement across the ice field. Polar bears possess one of the most sensitive noses in the animal kingdom, capable of detecting seals beneath 3 feet of snow from a mile away, or the scent of a whale carcass from 20 miles downwind. To this particular bear, the concentrated food aromas represented something unprecedented in his experience. While polar bears in some areas had learned to associate human presence with potential food sources, garbage dumps, hunting camps, research stations, the sheer volume and variety of scents emanating from the cruise ship triggered an investigative response that overrode his normal caution around large, unfamiliar objects. On the ship's deck 5, in the main galley, Chef Dubois was unaware of the drama unfolding above. The 52-year-old Frenchman was overseeing preparation of that evening's dinner service, herb-crusted Arctic char, reindeer medallions with juniper berry sauce, roasted root vegetables, and fresh bread baked throughout the day. The galley's ventilation system, designed to handle the intense heat and steam generated by cooking for over 1,100 people, drew air from the cooking areas and expelled it through carefully engineered vents positioned along the ship's superstructure. Chef Dubois, called sous chef Maria Santos, a 31-year-old Spaniard who specialized in seafood preparation. "The Arctic char is ready for the final seasoning. Should we prepare the salmon course as well, or wait for the second seating?" "Prepare everything now," Chef Dubois replied, his French accent evident even in English. "With the bear sighting, many passengers may want to dine early to return to viewing before the light changes. Better to be ready than to keep hungry guests waiting." The irony of the situation would become apparent only in retrospect. The very efforts to provide passengers with an exceptional dining experience were creating the olfactory trail that would draw the polar bear into increasingly risky behavior. As the afternoon progressed and dinner preparation intensified, the scent plume from the ship's galley expanded across the ice field, carried by the steady northwest wind directly toward the bear's position. Dr. Rebecca Thorne, monitoring the situation from the ship's forward observation deck, was beginning to feel a growing sense of unease. Her decades of experience with polar bear behavior had taught her to recognize subtle signs that might indicate a change from normal foraging behavior to something more concerning. The bear's continued presence in the area, combined with his obvious interest in the ship, was beginning to trigger her professional instincts for caution. "Captain Haugen," she radioed to the bridge, "I recommend we begin preparing for a possible relocation." The bear has been focused on our position for over 30 minutes now, which is atypical for normal hunting behavior. While there's no immediate danger, I think we should be ready to increase distance if his behavior changes. On the bridge, Captain Haugen received the recommendation with the serious consideration it deserved. Dr. Thorne's reputation and experience commanded respect throughout the expedition cruise industry, and her conservative approach to wildlife encounters had prevented numerous potentially dangerous situations during her career. "Understood, Dr. Thorne," Captain Haugen replied. "We'll maintain current position for now, but stand by for immediate repositioning if necessary. How much distance would you recommend?" "Standard protocol calls for at least 300 meters from polar bears, but given his size and behavior, I'd prefer to see 500 meters minimum. If he enters the water, we should immediately increase to 1,000 meters." The conversation was overheard by several passengers near the communication stations, and word of the potential move began spreading through the observation areas. For many passengers, the possibility of losing their front row seats to observe polar bear behavior was disappointing. But those with Arctic experience understood the wisdom of erring on the side of caution when dealing with the Arctic's apex predator. Jennifer Park, the travel blogger whose Instagram documentation of the voyage had been providing real-time updates to her followers, was live-streaming the bear encounter to an audience that had grown to over 15,000 viewers. Her commentary mixed excitement with the kind of casual confidence that often characterized social media personalities encountering exotic wildlife for the first time. "Okay, Arctic adventurers," Jennifer spoke into her phone while simultaneously filming the bear with her stabilized camera system. "We've got this absolutely massive polar bear just hanging out on the ice like he owns the place. The crew is being super cautious, which I guess is smart, but honestly he looks pretty chill to me, just doing his bear thing, you know?" Her live audience was responding with a mixture of excitement and concern, comments flowing past faster than Jennifer could read them. Many viewers were sharing the stream, expanding the audience to include wildlife experts and Arctic researchers from around the world who began offering commentary and advice through the comment system. Dr. Stephen Blackwood, a polar bear researcher from the University of Alaska who happened to be following Jennifer's stream, typed a comment that unfortunately went unnoticed in the flood of responses. That bear's body language suggests increasing agitation. The repetitive head movements and constant scent testing are concerning. Ship should increase distance immediately. The warning might have changed everything that followed, but it disappeared into the digital noise of thousands of simultaneous conversations among viewers who lacked the expertise to distinguish between informed concern and casual speculation. Meanwhile, on the ice, the polar bear had dropped back to all four paws and was beginning to move parallel to the ship's position, maintaining approximately the same distance while traveling in a direction that would intersect with the vessel's current heading. This behavior pattern, known to researchers as intercepting, was one of the more concerning developments Dr. Thorne could observe. Rather than moving away from the ship or maintaining his original hunting focus, the bear was positioning himself to encounter the vessel more directly. "Jonathan, are you seeing this?" Dr. Chen called to her colleague, who was tracking the bear's movement through his telephoto lens. "He's not just moving randomly. There's purpose in that direction change." Jonathan Price lowered his camera and studied the bear's movement with naked eyes before raising the camera again for a closer look. His years of photographing predators in their natural environments had taught him to recognize the subtle differences between normal animal behavior and the focused intensity that preceded hunting or territorial behavior. "You're absolutely right," Jonathan confirmed. "And look at his gait. That's not the relaxed walk of an animal simply traveling across his territory. He's moving with purpose, and that purpose seems to involve us." The realization prompted Jonathan to radio Dr. Thorne directly. As a professional wildlife photographer with credentials recognized by the expedition cruise industry, Jonathan had been granted communication privileges that allowed him to contact the expedition leader when wildlife-related concerns arose. Dr. Thorne, this is Jonathan Price on Deck 7. I'm observing what appears to be purposeful movement by the bear toward an intercept course with our position. Recommend immediate consultation on repositioning. Dr. Thorne's response was immediate and decisive. Thank you for the observation, Mr. Price. I concur with your assessment. Captain Haugen, recommend immediate repositioning to increase distance from the bear to 800 meters minimum. On the bridge, Captain Haugen was already reviewing the ship's options for repositioning. The Aurora Borealis was equipped with sophisticated dynamic positioning systems and powerful thrusters that allowed for precise maneuvering in ice-filled waters, but any movement needed to account for ice conditions, wind direction, and the safety of the vessel and all aboard. Navigation, plot a course to position us 800 meters southwest of current location, Captain Haugen ordered. Slow ahead on thrusters, maintain ice watch, and monitor bear position throughout the maneuver. The ship's movement was barely perceptible to passengers, a gentle shift in position that required nearly 15 minutes to complete. The Aurora Borealis moved slowly and carefully, her crew monitoring ice conditions to ensure the repositioning didn't bring them into contact with submerged ice or create dangerous pressure on the hull. But as the ship began its careful repositioning, the polar bear's behavior changed dramatically. Instead of continuing his parallel course, he suddenly altered direction and began moving directly toward the water's edge nearest the ship's new position. His pace increased noticeably, and his head remained focused on the vessel with an intensity that immediately alarmed every experienced Arctic observer aboard. All passengers, please move to interior viewing areas immediately, Dr. Thorne announced over the ship's communication system, her voice carrying an unmistakable note of urgency. We have a polar bear approaching the water's edge, and as a precautionary measure, we need everyone to move away from exterior decks. The announcement created an immediate stir among the passengers. Those who had been casually observing the bear suddenly realized they might be witnessing something far more serious than a routine wildlife encounter. The movement from exterior decks to interior viewing areas was swift but not panicked, as most passengers trusted the crew's expertise and followed instructions without question. However, Jonathan Price and Dr. Chen remained on the observation deck, both having obtained permission from Dr. Thorne to continue documenting the encounter from a professional perspective. As wildlife professionals, their footage and observations could prove valuable for both scientific understanding and future safety protocols. "Sarah, this is unprecedented," Jonathan murmured. His camera focused on the bear as the massive animal reached the water's edge. "I've photographed polar bears for 15 years, and I've never seen approach behavior like this toward a large vessel." Through his telephoto lens, Jonathan could see details that were invisible to observers using binoculars or naked eyes. The bear's facial expression showed none of the relaxed curiosity typical of bears investigating human presence. Instead, his small, dark eyes held an intensity that suggested focused determination. His massive paws tested the water temperature repeatedly, and his body language indicated preparation for swimming rather than casual investigation. Dr. Chen was documenting the encounter with video equipment, her camera capturing not just the bear's behavior, but also the ship's response and the atmospheric conditions that might influence the animal's decision-making. The scientific value of the footage was already apparent, regardless of how the situation developed. The water temperature has to be close to freezing, Dr. Chen observed. For him to consider entering water this cold, whatever is motivating him has to be incredibly compelling. What was motivating the polar bear was indeed compelling, though the full extent of the behavioral triggers wouldn't be understood until much later. The combination of concentrated food aromas, the ship's movement patterns that suggested potential territorial intrusion, and possibly even the electromagnetic fields generated by the vessel's sophisticated electronic systems had created a perfect storm of stimuli that triggered the bear's investigative response. Polar bears are known to be curious animals, but their curiosity is typically balanced by caution, especially around unfamiliar objects as large as a cruise ship. This particular bear, however, was demonstrating behavior that suggested either exceptional boldness or a level of motivation that overrode normal caution. Both possibilities represented significant danger for anyone who might find themselves in direct contact with the animal. As the Aurora Borealis completed her repositioning maneuver, now positioned approximately 850 meters from the bear's location, the crew and passengers hoped the increased distance would discourage any attempt by the bear to approach the vessel through the water. Polar bears were capable swimmers, but 850 meters represented a significant distance in near-freezing water, especially for an approach that offered no guaranteed reward. But the bear had already made his decision. Without hesitation, he entered the water with the practiced ease of an animal perfectly adapted to Arctic marine conditions. His massive body slipped into the dark water with surprising grace, and within moments he was swimming directly toward the ship with powerful, steady strokes. "Bear in the water," Dr. Thorne announced over the ship's communication system, her voice now carrying unmistakable alarm. "All passengers must remain in interior areas. This is not a drill. We have a polar bear swimming directly toward the vessel." On the bridge, Captain Haugen was faced with a decision that could have life or death consequences. The ship could attempt to outrun the swimming bear, but polar bears were capable of swimming at speeds up to 6 miles per hour, and the Aurora Borealis needed time and distance to build speed in ice-filled waters. Alternatively, the ship could maintain position and hope the bear's curiosity would be satisfied by a close approach without attempting to board the vessel. "Dr. Thorne, what's your assessment of risk if the bear reaches the hull?" Captain Haugen radioed. "Captain, polar bears are excellent climbers and have been documented boarding vessels as large as icebreakers. With our lower deck clearance and exterior stairways, boarding is definitely possible. Recommend immediate departure from the area. Navigation, prepare for emergency repositioning. Full ahead on main engines, course southwest. Maintain ice watch for safe navigation." The Aurora Borealis began to build speed, her powerful engines driving the ice-strengthened hull through the water with increasing velocity. But the polar bear continued his determined approach, his swimming stroke powerful and steady, covering the distance faster than many observers thought possible. Jennifer Park, still live-streaming from an interior viewing area, was providing real-time commentary to an audience that had now grown to over 30,000 viewers worldwide. Her excitement was increasingly tempered by awareness that she might be documenting something genuinely dangerous. "Guys, this is getting really intense," Jennifer spoke into her camera while filming through the thick glass of the interior observation lounge. "The bear is actually swimming toward us, and the ship is trying to get away. I've never seen anything like this. The crew is definitely taking this seriously now." Among her viewers, Dr. Blackwood continued attempting to provide expert guidance through the comment system, but his warnings were lost in the flood of responses from viewers around the world. Wildlife experts, Arctic researchers, and polar bear specialists were all attempting to offer advice and insight, but the digital chaos of the live stream made coherent communication impossible. Back on the observation deck, Jonathan Price and Dr. Chen were documenting what would become some of the most important wildlife behavior footage ever captured. The polar bear's approach was unlike anything either scientist had witnessed, and their professional documentation would later prove crucial for understanding the incident. "Jonathan, look at his swimming technique," Dr. Chen observed. "That's not the stroke pattern of a bear pursuing seals or fish. He's swimming with the efficiency of an animal covering distance to reach a specific target." Jonathan adjusted his camera settings to compensate for the changing light as clouds began building on the horizon. "And look at his direction. He's not just swimming toward where we are, he's calculating where we'll be. That's sophisticated spatial reasoning." The observation was correct and deeply concerning. The polar bear was demonstrating problem-solving behavior that indicated high intelligence and determination. Rather than swimming directly toward the ship's current position, he was angling his approach to intercept the vessel's projected course, behavior that suggested he understood the ship's movement patterns and was planning accordingly. As the distance between bear and ship decreased to approximately 400 meters, Dr. Thorne made a decision that would save countless lives. "Captain Haugen, recommend immediate deployment of sound deterrent. We need to discourage this approach before the bear gets any closer." The Aurora Borealis was equipped with various wildlife deterrent systems, including high-powered sound devices designed to discourage aggressive approaches by marine mammals. The sound deterrent system could generate acoustic signals at frequencies and volumes that were uncomfortable for most Arctic wildlife without causing permanent damage. "Sound deterrent activated," reported First Officer Anderson from the bridge. The system generated a series of loud, sharp acoustic pulses that could be heard clearly throughout the ship and across the water to the approaching bear. The effect on the polar bear was immediate, but not what the crew had hoped. Instead of deterring the approach, the sound signals seemed to increase the bear's agitation and determination. His swimming stroke became more aggressive, and his head remained fixed on the ship with unwavering focus. "The deterrent isn't working," Dr. Thorne reported. "If anything, it's making him more aggressive. Recommend discontinuing acoustic signals and preparing for potential contact." Captain Haugen faced a decision no cruise ship captain ever wanted to make. The Aurora Borealis could continue attempting to outrun the bear, but with 847 passengers aboard, any maneuver that risked collision with ice or other hazards could be catastrophic. Alternatively, the ship could prepare for the possibility that the bear might reach the hull and attempt to board. "All crew to emergency stations," Captain Haugen announced over the internal communication system. "Initiate polar bear contact protocol. Security teams to stations, emergency response teams to ready positions." The ship's security team, led by Chief Security Officer Hans Bergen, a former Norwegian military officer with Arctic training, began implementing procedures that had been developed for exactly this type of scenario, but never actually tested under real conditions. The protocol called for securing all exterior access points, deploying personnel with non-lethal deterrent equipment, and establishing communication with Norwegian authorities for potential emergency assistance. Meanwhile, the polar bear continued his relentless approach. At 200 meters from the ship, observers could clearly see the power and determination in his swimming stroke. His massive head remained above water, breathing steadily as he covered the remaining distance with the confidence of an apex predator that had never encountered anything he couldn't handle. Dr. Tanaka, the anthropologist who had shared stories about polar bears in Inuit culture, stood with Father Kowalski and several other passengers in the main observation lounge, watching the unprecedented event unfold through the large windows. "In traditional stories," Dr. Tanaka said quietly, "when the spirit of the ice chooses to approach humans directly, it means the balance between worlds has been disturbed. This is not normal behavior for any polar bear." Father Kowalski nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes nature teaches us lessons we didn't know we needed to learn. Whatever happens here today, I think we're all being changed by witnessing it. Their conversation was interrupted by another announcement from Dr. Thorne. Ladies and gentlemen, the polar bear is now within 100 meters of the ship. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions. We are in contact with emergency services and have protocols in place for this situation. At 100 meters, the details of the polar bear became clearly visible to everyone aboard. This was not just a large polar bear. This was a magnificent specimen in perfect physical condition, his coat gleaming white against the dark water, his powerful shoulders driving each swimming stroke with incredible force. His black nose and small dark eyes remained fixed on the ship with unwavering focus. Jonathan Pryce continued documenting every moment, his telephoto lens capturing details that would later prove crucial for understanding the incident. Sarah, look at his eyes. There's intelligence there, but also something else. It's like he's made a decision about something, and nothing is going to change his mind. Dr. Chen was recording both video and audio, including the ambient sounds of the ship, the water, and the reactions of passengers and crew. Whatever happens, we're documenting something that's never been recorded before. This footage could be incredibly important for future polar bear research and safety protocols. At 50 meters from the ship, the polar bear's swimming stroke remained strong and steady, showing no signs of fatigue despite having covered nearly 800 meters in near-freezing water. His breathing was controlled and regular, and his direction remained focused on the Aurora Borealis with laser-like precision. Chief Security Officer Bergen and his team had positioned themselves along the ship's lower decks, equipped with emergency flares, sound devices, and other non-lethal deterrent equipment. Their training had prepared them for various wildlife encounters, but none had ever faced the prospect of a determined polar bear attempting to board a passenger vessel. "All stations report ready," Bergen radioed to the bridge. "Bear deterrent equipment deployed, emergency response teams in position. Recommend all passengers remain in interior areas until situation is resolved." The bear reached the ship's hull at exactly 4:47 p.m. local time, according to the ship's log. The impact of his massive paws against the steel hull created a sound that resonated throughout the vessel, a deep, hollow clang that immediately silenced conversations throughout the passenger areas. For a moment, the bear floated alongside the ship, his massive head just above water level as he investigated the hull's surface. His powerful front paws explored the steel plating, and his black nose tested various scents and textures. To observers looking down from the ship's decks, the sheer size of the animal was overwhelming. His head alone appeared nearly 3 feet long, and his shoulders extended well beyond what seemed possible for any terrestrial predator. Then, to the horror of everyone watching, the polar bear began attempting to climb the ship's hull. Polar bears are remarkably accomplished climbers, capable of scaling vertical ice faces and rocky cliffs with surprising agility for such massive animals. Their claws, designed for gripping ice and prey, found purchase on the Aurora Borealis's hull fittings, and their powerful shoulders and legs began driving them upward toward the ship's lowest deck level. "Bear is attempting to board," Chief Bergen reported to the bridge. "All personnel clear deck 2 starboard side, deploying deterrent measures." The security team activated emergency flares and sound devices, creating a cacophony of noise and light designed to discourage the bear's climbing attempt. But rather than retreating, the polar bear seemed to become more determined, his climbing efforts intensifying as he found better grip points on the ship's exterior fixtures. In the observation areas, passengers watched in fascination and growing alarm as the massive predator demonstrated climbing abilities that few had imagined possible. The bear's progress up the ship's side was slow but steady, each movement calculated and powerful. Jennifer Park's live stream audience had grown to over 50,000 viewers, with news outlets around the world beginning to pick up the feed. Her commentary had shifted from excitement to obvious concern as the reality of the situation became apparent. "Okay, this is definitely not normal tourist stuff anymore," Jennifer spoke into her camera, her voice tight with tension. "This bear is literally trying to get on the ship. I can't believe what I'm seeing here." Dr. Thorne, monitoring the situation from multiple vantage points, was coordinating the ship's response while simultaneously documenting the bear's behavior for future analysis. Never in her decades of Arctic experience had she witnessed such determined approach behavior from a polar bear toward a large vessel. "Captain, the bear has reached deck 2 level and is continuing to climb," she reported. "Standard deterrent measures are ineffective. We need to consider emergency protocols." The emergency protocols that Dr. Thorne referenced were among the most serious measures available to expedition cruise ships operating in polar regions. They included the authority to use lethal force against wildlife if human life was determined to be in immediate danger. However, the decision to escalate to lethal measures required confirmation from multiple authorities and was considered a last resort under all circumstances. Captain Haugen was faced with an impossible decision. The polar bear represented a clear threat to passenger and crew safety, but the animal was also a protected species in one of the world's most pristine wilderness areas. The killing of a polar bear, even in self-defense, would trigger investigations, legal proceedings, and international attention that could devastate both his career and the expedition cruise industry's reputation. "Dr. Thorne, what's your assessment of immediate danger to passengers and crew?" Captain Haugen radioed. "Captain, if this bear reaches passenger areas, the potential for casualties is extreme. Polar bears are capable of breaking through glass, doors, and light barriers. Our interior spaces were not designed to contain a determined polar bear." As if to emphasize Dr. Thorne's assessment, the polar bear successfully reached deck 2 and began investigating the ship's superstructure with obvious intelligence and purpose. His massive paws tested handholds and barriers, and his black nose investigated air vents, doorways, and windows. The ship's passengers, watching from interior viewing areas, could now see the polar bear at nearly eye level through the thick glass windows. The animal's size and power were overwhelming when observed at close range. His head alone was larger than most adult humans, and his massive shoulders suggested strength beyond anything most people had ever imagined. Dr. Müller, the German glaciologist, was documenting the encounter from a scientific perspective, his notes and observations potentially valuable for future research. "The bear is demonstrating problem-solving behavior that suggests high cognitive ability," he noted. "His investigation of the ship's structure appears systematic and purposeful." But it was Margaret O'Brien, the retired teacher from Dublin, who first noticed the change in the bear's behavior that would prove crucial to everything that followed. "Look at his nose," she said quietly to the small group gathered around her. "He's not just investigating randomly anymore. He's following something specific." Mrs. O'Brien's observation was correct and terrifying. The polar bear had detected a concentrated scent trail leading from the ship's galley ventilation system, and he was now following that trail with the focused determination of a predator pursuing prey. His movement along deck 2 became more purposeful as he tracked the cooking aromas to their source. In the ship's galley, Chef Dubois and his staff were unaware of the drama unfolding directly above them. The dinner preparation continued, with hundreds of pounds of fish, meat, and other aromatic ingredients being prepared according to the evening's menu. The galley's ventilation system continued drawing cooking aromas from the preparation areas and expelling them through vents positioned along the ship's superstructure. "Chef," called sous chef Santos, Should we suspend dinner preparation? I'm hearing announcements about some kind of emergency situation. Chef Dubois paused in his preparation work, listening to the ship's communication system for the first time since the crisis began. "Polar bear approaching the ship," he repeated. "Mon Dieu, we need to shut down the ventilation system immediately." But it was too late. The polar bear had located the primary galley ventilation outlet and was investigating it with intense focus. His powerful claws began testing the metal grating that covered the vent opening, and it quickly became apparent that the barrier was not designed to withstand the strength of a determined polar bear. "Bear is investigating galley ventilation system," Chief Bergen reported to the bridge. "The vent grating is not secure enough to prevent access. Recommend immediate evacuation of galley areas." The evacuation of the ship's galley created additional complications. Chef Dubois and his staff of 15 needed to secure cooking equipment, shut down ventilation systems, and evacuate through corridors that might bring them dangerously close to the bear's probable entry point. The galley was located on Deck 3, directly below the bear's current position, with multiple access points that could be compromised if the animal gained interior access. Meanwhile, on Deck 2, the polar bear had begun systematically testing the ventilation grating with increasing force. His massive paws, each equipped with claws that could reach 4 inches in length, found purchase on the metal framework and began applying pressure that the system was never designed to resist. Jonathan Price and Dr. Chen, still documenting the encounter from their observation position, watched in horrified fascination as the bear demonstrated problem-solving abilities that exceeded their expectations of polar bear intelligence. "He's figured out that the scents are coming from inside the ship, and he's working out how to get to the source," Jonathan observed. "This isn't random behavior or simple curiosity. This is systematic investigation with a specific goal." Dr. Chen continued her video documentation while providing scientific commentary. "The bear's behavior suggests he's identified the ship as a potential food source, and he's attempting to access that source through the most direct route available. This level of persistence and problem-solving is extraordinary." Their professional assessment was accurate and deeply concerning. The polar bear was demonstrating cognitive abilities and persistence that made him far more dangerous than a merely curious wild animal. His investigation of the ship had evolved into a determined attempt to access what he perceived as a significant food source. The ventilation grating failed at 5:12 p.m. local time. The sound of tearing metal was audible throughout the ship as the polar bear's powerful claws and massive strength overcame the barriers that separated him from the ship's interior. The opening he created was large enough for his enormous body to pass through, providing direct access to the ventilation system and the interior spaces beyond. "Bear has breached exterior barriers," Chief Bergen announced over the emergency communication system. "All personnel evacuate areas below Deck 2 starboard side. Bear has access to ship's interior." The announcement triggered the ship's most serious emergency protocols. Passengers in potentially affected areas were evacuated to secure locations. Crew members not directly involved in emergency response were moved to safe areas. And all ship systems not essential for safety and navigation were shut down to reduce potential hazards. Dr. Thorne coordinated the emergency response while maintaining communication with Norwegian authorities who were preparing to dispatch emergency assistance. However, the Aurora Borealis was positioned in one of the most remote areas of the Arctic Ocean, and any emergency response would require several hours to reach their location. "Norwegian Coast Guard, this is expedition vessel Aurora Borealis," Dr. Thorne radioed. "We have a polar bear that has gained access to ship's interior spaces. Request immediate emergency assistance and guidance on wildlife management protocols." The response from the Norwegian Coast Guard confirmed what everyone aboard already knew. They were largely on their own until help could arrive. "Aurora Borealis, this is Longyearbyen Coast Guard. Emergency response helicopter dispatched, but weather conditions and distance mean ETA is approximately 4 hours. Maintain safety protocols and avoid direct contact with the animal. 4 hours represented an eternity when dealing with a massive polar bear loose inside a passenger ship. The Aurora Borealis crew would need to manage the situation using their own resources and expertise while protecting the lives of over 1,100 people aboard. The polar bear's entry into the ship's ventilation system created immediate complications. The ventilation ductwork was large enough to accommodate his body, but not designed for the weight and movement of an 800-pound animal. His progress through the system was accompanied by the sounds of bending metal, torn insulation, and debris falling through ducts throughout the affected sections of the ship. Passengers in the interior observation areas could hear the bear's movement through the walls and ceilings, a constant reminder that one of the Arctic's most dangerous predators was somewhere within the ship's structure. The psychological impact on passengers was significant, with many expressing fear, disbelief, and concern for their safety. Father Kowalski attempted to provide comfort to frightened passengers, his pastoral training serving him well in the crisis situation. "We're in the hands of experienced professionals who know how to handle these situations," he reassured a group of elderly passengers who were particularly distressed by the developments. "Sometimes the most extraordinary experiences come when we least expect them." Dr. Tanaka continued her anthropological perspective on the situation, drawing from traditional knowledge that might provide insight into the bear's behavior. In Inuit tradition, when the spirit of the ice comes so close to humans, it often means there's something that needs to be understood or resolved. Maybe this bear is trying to teach us something important, but the immediate concern was not spiritual or educational. It was the very real danger posed by a massive polar bear moving through the ship's interior spaces with apparent purpose and determination. The bear's progress through the ventilation system could be tracked by sound, and his movement suggested he was following the scent trail toward the galley areas. Chef Dubois and his staff had evacuated the galley successfully, but the area remained filled with hundreds of pounds of prepared food, cooking equipment at various temperatures, and the concentrated aromas that had attracted the bear in the first place. If the bear reached the galley, the combination of abundant food and potential territorial behavior could create an extremely dangerous situation. Chief Bergen and his security team were attempting to track the bear's movement and position personnel to respond if he emerged from the ventilation system. However, the ship's interior layout made it impossible to predict exactly where the bear might appear, and the confined spaces of interior corridors would make any direct confrontation extremely hazardous. "Security teams maintain safe distance and avoid direct confrontation," Bergen instructed his personnel. "Our priority is passenger and crew safety. We observe and report, but do not engage unless absolutely necessary for human safety." The wisdom of Bergen's approach became apparent when the bear emerged from the ventilation system directly into the ship's main galley at 5:31 p.m. local time. The sound of his arrival, a combination of falling ceiling tiles, bent metal, and the impact of 800 pounds of polar bear dropping 8 feet to the galley floor, was audible throughout that section of the ship. Video surveillance systems in the galley provided the crew with real-time imagery of the bear's behavior, footage that would later become some of the most studied wildlife behavior documentation ever recorded. The polar bear's reaction to finding himself in the ship's galley exceeded everyone's expectations for both intelligence and restraint. Rather than the destructive rampage that might be expected from a large predator suddenly finding himself in an unfamiliar environment filled with food, the bear began systematically investigating his surroundings with obvious curiosity and intelligence. His massive nose tested various scents and food sources, and his behavior suggested recognition that he had found the source of the aromas that had originally attracted his attention. Incredible, murmured Dr. Chen, watching the surveillance feed from the ship's emergency coordination center. Look at how carefully he's moving. He's investigating everything methodically, not randomly destroying anything. Jonathan Price was documenting the surveillance footage with his camera, creating a permanent record of behavior that no wildlife photographer had ever captured. He's treating the galley like a new territory that he needs to understand before deciding how to proceed. That level of behavioral control is extraordinary for any wild animal in such an alien environment. The polar bear's investigation of the galley revealed intelligence that surprised even experienced Arctic wildlife experts. He tested various food sources with his nose before deciding what to investigate further. He explored cooking equipment and storage areas with obvious curiosity, but without unnecessary destruction. His movements were careful and deliberate, suggesting awareness that he was in an unfamiliar environment that required caution. However, the bear's presence in the galley created immediate safety concerns that extended beyond his current location. The galley connected to dining areas, passenger corridors, and other sections of the ship where people might inadvertently encounter the animal. Additionally, the bear's extended presence in the confined space could lead to territorial behavior if he decided the galley represented a new den or feeding area. Dr. Thorne consulted with Captain Haugen on options for encouraging the bear to leave the ship voluntarily. The longer he remains inside, the more likely he is to establish territorial behavior, she explained. We need to find a way to encourage him to return to the ice through the same route he used to enter. What are our options for non-lethal encouragement? Captain Haugen asked. We could try cutting power to the galley ventilation system, which would reduce the scent trail. We could also attempt to create a more attractive scent trail leading back toward his entry point. But there are no guarantees with an animal showing this level of unusual behavior. The attempt to modify the bear's environment began with shutting down all galley ventilation systems and sealing off air circulation that might carry cooking aromas to other parts of the ship. The theory was that reducing the concentrated scent that had originally attracted the bear might encourage him to investigate other areas or seek an exit route. Additionally, the crew began preparing fish and other aromatic foods near the bear's entry point, hoping to create a scent trail that would draw him back toward the exterior of the ship. The plan required precise coordination to ensure crew safety while providing the bear with an attractive alternative to remaining in the galley. However, the polar bear's response to these environmental modifications was not what the crew expected. Rather than showing interest in leaving the galley, he began more thoroughly exploring the food sources available in his current location. His investigation became more focused and purposeful, suggesting that he had decided the galley represented a significant resource worth defending. He's not responding to our attempts to redirect him, Dr. Thorne reported. If anything, he seems to be settling in and treating the galley as his territory. This is extremely concerning behavior. The escalation in the bear's territorial behavior was evident in several ways. His body language became more assertive as he moved through the galley. His investigation of food sources became more aggressive, and he began testing potential defensive positions that would allow him to control access to the area. These were all classic signs of a polar bear establishing territorial control over a resource-rich area. At 6:15 p.m. local time, the situation took a dramatic turn when the bear began attempting to access additional areas of the ship from his position in the galley. The galley connected to dining areas, storage rooms, and service corridors that could provide access to passenger areas. The bear's investigation of these connection points suggested he was expanding his territorial claim beyond the original galley space. Bear is testing access points to other areas of the ship, Chief Bergen reported. He's investigated 3 different doorways and appears to be trying to access dining areas. Recommend immediate evacuation of all areas within 2 decks of the galley. The evacuation order affected over 300 passengers and crew members, requiring coordination of temporary housing in other areas of the ship while maintaining essential services and safety protocols. The Aurora Borealis was well equipped to handle emergency situations, but the extended presence of a polar bear in critical ships areas created challenges that no emergency protocol had specifically anticipated. Meanwhile, Jennifer Park's live stream had become an international sensation, with news outlets around the world picking up her feed and providing expert commentary on the unfolding situation. Her audience had grown to over 100,000 viewers, including wildlife experts, Arctic researchers, and government officials who were following the incident in real time. "This is absolutely unprecedented," commented Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a polar bear specialist from Polar Bears International, who had joined a news broadcast featuring Jennifer's footage. "The behavior we're seeing suggests a level of problem-solving and territorial establishment that challenges our understanding of polar bear cognition and adaptability. The international attention brought both benefits and complications. Wildlife experts around the world were offering advice and insight through various communication channels, but the volume of input was overwhelming the ship's communication systems. Additionally, the media attention was creating pressure for rapid resolution of the situation, pressure that could lead to decisions prioritizing public relations over safety and wildlife conservation. Dr. Thorne found herself managing not only the immediate crisis, but also fielding calls from wildlife organizations, government officials, and media outlets seeking information about the incident. The Arctic research community was particularly interested in the unprecedented behavioral documentation, while government officials were concerned about potential legal and diplomatic implications of the situation. "The scientific value of what we're documenting is extraordinary," Dr. Thorne explained to a representative from the Norwegian Environmental Ministry. "But our immediate priority has to be the safety of passengers and crew, followed by the welfare of the bear. Any decisions about intervention need to balance these priorities." The Norwegian government's position was clear. Every effort should be made to resolve the situation without harm to the polar bear, but human safety was the ultimate priority. If the situation escalated to the point where human life was in immediate danger, the ship's crew had authority to use any means necessary to protect passengers and crew. However, the definition of immediate danger remained subjective and complicated by the bear's current behavior. While his presence aboard the ship was certainly dangerous, his actual conduct had been remarkably restrained for such a large predator in an alien environment. He had not attempted to break through barriers to reach passenger areas, and his investigation of the galley had been systematic rather than destructive. The complexity of the situation was further complicated by the bear's continued presence in ship systems. His movement through ventilation ducts had damaged heating and air circulation systems, creating potential safety issues for passengers and crew beyond the direct threat posed by the animal himself. The ship's environmental systems were crucial for survival in Arctic conditions, and any extended disruption could create serious problems. Chief Engineer Olaf Peterson was monitoring the ship's systems and coordinating repairs that could be accomplished while the bear remained aboard. "We've got damage to primary ventilation systems on decks 2 and 3, he reported. "Heating systems are operating at reduced capacity, and we'll need to implement alternative air circulation protocols if this situation continues much longer." The engineering challenges were compounded by the fact that many critical systems ran through areas that might be accessible to the bear. Repair work could not begin until the animal's location and movement patterns were better understood, and even then, crew safety would require extensive precautions. As evening approached and the Arctic sky began its gradual transition toward the pale twilight that characterized summer nights at high latitudes, the bear's behavior began showing signs of change. Rather than continuing his investigation of the galley and surrounding areas, he began what appeared to be preparation for rest or extended occupation of the space. Polar bears typically sleep 7 to 8 hours per day, often in short naps spread throughout a 24-hour period. The bear's behavior suggested he might be preparing to settle in for an extended rest period, which could complicate efforts to encourage him to leave the ship voluntarily. If he decides to den in the galley area, we could be dealing with territorial behavior that's much more difficult to modify, Dr. Thorne explained to Captain Haugen. Polar bears are extremely protective of den sites and food sources. Once he's established this area as his territory, removing him becomes significantly more dangerous. The prospect of the bear establishing the ship's galley as a long-term den site was among the worst-case scenarios the crew had considered. Not only would it make the animal more dangerous to approach, but it would also complicate any eventual resolution by triggering stronger territorial instincts. Captain Haugen was faced with increasingly difficult decisions as the situation extended beyond the normal parameters of wildlife encounters. Dr. Thorne, what are our realistic options for resolution if the bear establishes territorial behavior? Our options become much more limited, Dr. Thorne replied honestly. We could attempt to wait him out, hoping he eventually loses interest and leaves on his own. We could try more aggressive deterrent measures, though these carry risks of escalating his defensive behavior. Or we could consider tranquilization, though that would require specialized equipment and expertise we don't currently have aboard. JT, the tranquilization option was particularly complicated because the ship was not equipped with wildlife immobilization equipment, and the specialized knowledge required for safely sedating an 800-pound polar bear was not available among the current crew. Any attempt at chemical immobilization would require assistance from wildlife authorities, adding hours or days to the resolution timeline. As the ship's clocks approached 7 p.m. local time, the bear's behavior shifted again. Instead of settling in for rest, he began renewed investigation of his surroundings, this time focusing on areas that might provide access to other parts of the ship. His movement became more purposeful and directed, suggesting he had completed his initial territorial assessment and was ready to expand his exploration. Bear is moving again, Chief Bergen reported. He's investigating the main dining area connection points and appears to be testing barriers that separate him from passenger areas. The main dining area was separated from the galley by swinging doors and lightweight barriers designed for service efficiency rather than security against determined wildlife. If the bear managed to breach these barriers, he would have access to spaces that regularly accommodated hundreds of passengers and crew members. The prospect of the bear reaching passenger dining areas triggered the ship's most serious emergency protocols. These areas could not be effectively sealed or secured against a determined polar bear, and evacuation procedures would be complicated by the ship's layout and the large number of people who would need to be moved to safety. All passengers in decks 3 and 4 dining areas evacuate immediately to designated safe zones, Captain Haugen announced over the ship's communication system. This is not a drill. All passengers must move quickly and calmly to safe areas as directed by crew members. The evacuation was managed efficiently by crew members who had trained extensively for various emergency scenarios, but the movement of several hundred people through the ship's corridors created noise and activity that could potentially influence the bear's behavior. Additionally, the evacuation process brought people closer to areas where the bear might emerge if he successfully breached the barriers separating the galley from passenger areas. Dr. Chen and Jonathan Price continued documenting the situation from the ship's Emergency Coordination Center, their professional footage providing crucial documentation of both the bear's behavior and the ship's response protocols. The scientific value of their work was becoming increasingly apparent as the incident continued to challenge assumptions about polar bear behavior and intelligence. What we're seeing is unprecedented in the wildlife behavior literature, Dr. Chen observed as she reviewed footage of the bear's systematic investigation of ship systems. The level of problem-solving, environmental adaptation, and persistence suggests cognitive abilities that exceed our current understanding of polar bear intelligence. Jonathan's photography was capturing details that would prove crucial for future research and safety protocol development. Every image we're getting shows behavior that contradicts standard assumptions about how polar bears respond to unfamiliar environments. This bear is treating the ship like a new habitat that he needs to understand and potentially claim. Their professional assessment was providing valuable insight for the crew's decision-making process, but it was also confirming that the situation was far outside normal parameters for wildlife encounters. The bear's behavior suggested a level of adaptability and determination that made conventional deterrent methods potentially ineffective. At 7:23 p.m. local time, the bear successfully breached the barriers separating the galley from the main dining area. The sound of the lightweight doors being pushed aside by 800 pounds of determined polar bear was audible throughout the affected section of the ship. Surveillance cameras in the dining area provided clear imagery of the bear's entry into the space, footage that showed both his impressive physical presence and his continued systematic approach to investigating his new environment. The main dining area of the Aurora Borealis was designed to accommodate 400 guests at a time, with large windows providing panoramic views of the Arctic landscape, elegant table settings, and sophisticated lighting systems. The bear's presence in this refined environment created a surreal contrast that was captured in stunning detail by the ship's security cameras. Rather than the destructive behavior that might be expected from a wild predator in such an alien environment, the bear continued his pattern of careful, systematic investigation. He moved through the dining area with obvious curiosity, but without unnecessary destruction, testing scents and surfaces while maintaining the controlled behavior that had characterized his presence aboard the ship. "Unbelievable," murmured Chief Bergen as he watched the surveillance feed. "He's moving through a passenger dining area like he's conducting a careful inspection rather than following normal predator instincts." The bear's restraint was remarkable, but also concerning, as it suggested a level of environmental adaptation that could make him increasingly difficult to remove from the ship. His behavior indicated that he was treating the ship's interior spaces as potentially suitable habitat rather than an alien environment to be avoided. Dr. Thorne continued coordinating the emergency response while providing expert assessment of the bear's behavior. The fact that he's maintaining such controlled behavior in passenger areas actually makes the situation more dangerous, not less, she explained to Captain Haugen. It suggests he's becoming comfortable with the ship as habitat, which means he's less likely to leave voluntarily. The bear's movement through the dining area also provided him with access to additional ship systems and areas that could complicate resolution efforts. The dining area connected to kitchens, service corridors, and eventually to other passenger areas that would be impossible to evacuate and secure if the bear continued his expansion through the ship. Meanwhile, the international media attention continued growing as news outlets around the world picked up the story of a polar bear that had essentially hijacked a luxury cruise ship in the Arctic Ocean. The combination of dramatic wildlife footage, passenger safety concerns, and the exotic location created a story that captured global attention. BBC News, CNN, and other major outlets were providing live coverage of the situation, with expert commentary from wildlife biologists, Arctic researchers, and expedition cruise industry representatives. The coverage was generally factual and balanced, but the international attention was creating additional pressure for rapid resolution of the crisis. Dr. Mitchell from Polar Bears International appeared on multiple news programs, explaining the unprecedented nature of the bear's behavior. What we're witnessing challenges our fundamental understanding of polar bear cognition and adaptability, she explained to CNN's Arctic correspondent. This level of problem-solving and environmental adaptation suggests intelligence capabilities that exceed our current research findings. The scientific community's fascination with the incident was balanced by growing concern from passenger families and expedition cruise industry representatives. The longer the situation continued, the greater the potential impact on both passenger safety and industry reputation. Back aboard the Aurora Borealis, the bear had completed his investigation of the main dining area and was beginning to explore connection points that could provide access to other parts of the ship. His behavior remained systematic and controlled, but his expanding territorial claims were bringing him closer to areas that could not be evacuated or secured against his presence. Bear is investigating access points to passenger corridor systems, Chief Bergen reported. If he gains access to main passenger corridors, evacuation and containment becomes significantly more complicated. The passenger corridor systems of the Aurora Borealis were designed for efficient movement of large numbers of people between cabins, dining areas, entertainment venues, and observation decks. These corridors could not be effectively sealed against a determined polar bear, and evacuation would be complicated by the number of passengers and the limited alternative routes available. Captain Haugen was facing the most difficult decision of his 30-year maritime career. The bear's continued expansion through the ship was bringing him closer to direct contact with passengers, while conventional deterrent methods had proven ineffective against his unusual behavior patterns. Dr. Thorne, we need to discuss escalation options, Captain Haugen said privately. If this bear reaches passenger corridor areas, we may need to consider lethal intervention for passenger safety. Dr. Thorne understood the gravity of the captain's position, but her expertise suggested that lethal intervention might not be necessary if alternative approaches could be implemented quickly enough. Captain, I recommend we try one more approach before considering lethal options. If we can coordinate with the incoming Coast Guard helicopter to provide external deterrent support, we might be able to encourage the bear to exit through his original entry point. The plan required precise timing and coordination between the ship's crew and the Norwegian Coast Guard helicopter that was still approximately 2 hours away from their position. The helicopter could provide external sound and visual deterrents that might be more effective than the ship's internal systems for encouraging the bear to leave voluntarily. However, 2 hours represented significant time for the bear to continue expanding his territorial claims throughout the ship. The risk that he might encounter passengers or crew members during that time was substantial, particularly if his behavior changed from controlled investigation to defensive territoriality. Coordinate with Coast Guard helicopter for external deterrent support, Captain Haugen decided. Continue monitoring bear behavior and maintain passenger evacuation protocols. If the situation escalates before help arrives, we'll need to reconsider all options. The decision to wait for external assistance represented a calculated risk that balanced passenger safety against wildlife conservation concerns. The crew would need to manage the bear's presence for at least 2 more hours while preventing any direct contact between the animal and the people aboard. At 8:45 p.m. local time, the bear made the decision that would ultimately determine the outcome of the entire crisis. Instead of continuing his investigation of the ship's interior spaces, he began retracing his path back toward the galley area where he had originally entered the vessel. Bear is returning to galley area, Chief Bergen reported with obvious relief. Movement appears purposeful rather than random. He may be heading back toward his entry point. The change in behavior provided the first hopeful sign that the crisis might resolve without escalation to lethal intervention. If the bear was indeed heading back toward his original entry point, there was a possibility he might exit the ship voluntarily and return to the ice. Dr. Thorne monitored the bear's movement carefully, looking for behavioral signs that might indicate his intentions. His body language suggests he's made a decision about something, she observed. The way he's moving is different from his earlier investigation behavior, more purposeful and directed. The bear's return to the galley area took approximately 20 minutes, during which time he retraced much of his earlier route through the ship's interior spaces. His movement was efficient and direct, suggesting he had developed a mental map of the ship's layout during his earlier exploration. Once back in the galley, the bear's behavior shifted again. Instead of settling in or resuming his investigation of food sources, he began testing the ventilation opening through which he had originally entered the ship. His massive paws explored the opening, and his head extended through the gap to investigate the exterior environment. "He's definitely considering an exit," Dr. Thorne reported. "His investigation of the opening is much more focused than when he first arrived. He may be preparing to leave the ship." The prospect of voluntary departure was the best possible outcome for all concerned, but the bear's exit would need to be carefully managed to ensure he didn't reconsider and attempt to re-enter the ship. Additionally, his departure route would need to be monitored to confirm he was returning to the ice rather than attempting to access other parts of the vessel. At 9:17 p.m. local time, the polar bear began squeezing his massive body back through the ventilation opening he had used to enter the ship. The process was slow and complicated by his size, but his determination was obvious as he worked to extract himself from the ship's interior. "Bear is exiting the ship," Chief Bergen announced over the communication system. "Repeat, Bear is leaving the vessel through original entry point. All personnel maintain safe distance and avoid actions that might discourage departure." The bear's exit was as methodical and controlled as his earlier behavior had been. Despite the confined space and awkward positioning required to squeeze through the opening, he managed the process without apparent distress or aggressive behavior. His movements remained calculated and purposeful throughout the extraction process. Jonathan Price and Dr. Chen positioned themselves to document the bear's departure, their cameras capturing footage that would become some of the most important wildlife behavior documentation ever recorded. The bear's voluntary exit from such an alien environment represented behavior that challenged fundamental assumptions about polar bear adaptability and decision-making. "This is absolutely unprecedented," Dr. Chen observed as she filmed the bear's careful extraction from the ship. The fact that he explored the ship so thoroughly and then made a conscious decision to leave suggests cognitive abilities that exceed anything in the current literature. The bear's successful exit was completed at 9:31 p.m. local time, according to the ship's official log. Once free of the ventilation opening, he moved onto the ship's exterior deck and began investigating his options for returning to the ice. The ship's hull-to-ice distance had increased during the incident as the Aurora Borealis had maintained slow forward movement, requiring the bear to swim approximately 200 meters to reach the ice edge. Without hesitation, the bear entered the water and began swimming toward the ice with the same powerful, efficient stroke that had characterized his approach to the ship hours earlier. His departure was witnessed by hundreds of passengers who had gathered in interior viewing areas to observe the conclusion of their unprecedented Arctic encounter. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Haugen announced over the ship's communication system, "our polar bear visitor has departed the vessel and is returning to the ice. All passengers may now return to normal activities, though we'll continue monitoring the area to ensure the bear has moved away from our position. The bear's swim to the ice was completed efficiently, and once on solid ground, he began moving away from the ship with purpose and determination. His departure behavior suggested he had satisfied his curiosity about the vessel and was returning to normal polar bear activities in his natural habitat. Dr. Thorne coordinated with the Norwegian Coast Guard helicopter, which arrived at their position at 10:15 p.m. local time, nearly an hour after the bear had departed. The helicopter crew conducted an aerial survey of the area to confirm the bear's location and ensure he was not attempting to return to the ship. Aerial reconnaissance confirms bear has moved approximately 2 kilometers northwest of vessel position, reported the Coast Guard pilot. Animal appears to be exhibiting normal polar bear behavior and does not appear to be returning toward the ship. The confirmation allowed Captain Haugen to resume normal cruise operations, though enhanced wildlife monitoring protocols would remain in effect for the remainder of the voyage. The incident had consumed nearly 6 hours from initial sighting to final resolution, making it one of the longest wildlife encounters in expedition cruise history. The immediate aftermath of the incident involved extensive documentation and reporting requirements. Dr. Thorne needed to provide detailed reports to Norwegian wildlife authorities, international polar bear research organizations, and expedition cruise industry safety committees. The incident would trigger reviews of wildlife encounter protocols and could influence future safety regulations for Arctic cruise operations. Jonathan Price and Dr. Chen began the process of cataloging and analyzing the extensive footage and documentation they had gathered during the encounter. Their material represented the most comprehensive behavioral documentation of polar bear problem-solving and environmental adaptation ever recorded, with potential implications for wildlife research, conservation planning, and human-wildlife conflict management. The scientific value of what we documented today cannot be overstated, Dr. Chen explained to the assembled passengers during an impromptu briefing session. This bear demonstrated cognitive abilities and behavioral adaptability that will require us to revise our understanding of polar bear intelligence and problem-solving capabilities. The passengers themselves had been profoundly affected by the experience. Many described it as the most extraordinary wildlife encounter of their lives, while others expressed concern about the implications for Arctic wildlife and human activities in polar regions. The incident had provided them with insights into polar bear behavior that few humans had ever witnessed. Margaret O'Brien, the retired teacher from Dublin, reflected on the experience during the evening's informal passenger gathering. When I planned this trip, I hoped to see polar bears in their natural environment. I never imagined I'd see one demonstrate such intelligence and adaptability. It makes me think about how much we still don't understand about these magnificent animals. Father Kowalski offered a spiritual perspective on the encounter that resonated with many passengers. Today, we witnessed something that reminded us of our place in the natural world. This bear showed us intelligence, curiosity, and ultimately restraint that challenged our assumptions about the relationship between humans and wildlife. Dr. Tanaka continued developing her anthropological analysis of the incident, drawing connections between the bear's behavior and traditional indigenous knowledge about polar bear intelligence. In many Inuit stories, polar bears are credited with intelligence that rivals or exceeds human capability. Today's encounter provides evidence that these traditional beliefs may be more accurate than Western science has recognized. The media coverage of the incident continued to grow in the hours following the bear's departure. News outlets around the world featured the story as their lead item, with expert commentary providing context about polar bear behavior, Arctic tourism safety, and the implications of climate change for human-wildlife interactions in polar regions. Jennifer Park's livestream had captured much of the incident in real time, providing a unique perspective that complemented the professional documentation by Jonathan and Dr. Chen. Her footage had been viewed by millions of people worldwide, making the Aurora Borealis polar bear encounter one of the most widely witnessed wildlife events in history. "I still can't believe what we experienced today," Jennifer told her audience during a post-incident live stream. "This wasn't just about seeing a polar bear. This was about witnessing intelligence and problem-solving that completely changed how I think about wildlife. This bear wasn't just reacting to his environment, he was analyzing it, adapting to it, and making conscious decisions about how to interact with it." The expedition cruise industry began immediate reviews of the incident's implications for future operations. The Aurora Borealis had handled the crisis professionally and successfully, but the bear's unprecedented behavior suggested that existing wildlife encounter protocols might need significant updates to address similar situations. Dr. Rebecca Thorne was called upon to participate in industry-wide discussions about improving wildlife safety protocols. Her experience managing the crisis had demonstrated both the value of existing procedures and the need for enhanced preparation for unusual wildlife behavior. This incident shows us that we need to expect the unexpected when operating in Arctic environments, Dr. Thorne explained to a gathering of expedition cruise industry representatives. The bear's behavior was unprecedented, but our response protocols were generally effective. However, we need to improve our preparation for situations where wildlife demonstrates unusual intelligence and adaptability. The scientific community's response to the incident was immediate and enthusiastic. Polar bear researchers around the world requested access to the footage and documentation gathered during the encounter, recognizing its potential value for advancing understanding of polar bear cognition and behavior. Dr. Stephen Blackwood from the University of Alaska, who had been following the incident through Jennifer's livestream, initiated contact with Dr. Chen and Jonathan Price to discuss collaboration on analyzing the behavioral documentation. "What you've captured represents a paradigm shift in our understanding of polar bear intelligence," he explained. "This footage could revolutionize how we approach polar bear research and conservation." The Norwegian government launched an official investigation into the incident, not to assign blame, but to gather information that could improve future wildlife management and safety protocols. The investigation would examine the bear's behavior, the ship's response, and the broader implications for Arctic tourism and wildlife conservation. Environmental organizations used the incident to highlight the complex challenges facing Arctic wildlife as climate change altered traditional habitats and increased human activity in polar regions. The bear's behavior suggested both remarkable adaptability and potential new forms of human-wildlife conflict that required careful consideration. This incident demonstrates both the intelligence and adaptability of polar bears and the need for increased caution as human activity expands in Arctic regions, explained Dr. Sarah Mitchell from Polar Bears International. Climate change is forcing polar bears to explore new strategies for finding food and habitat, which could lead to more frequent encounters with human activities. The long-term implications of the incident extended beyond immediate safety and scientific considerations. The bear's behavior had demonstrated problem-solving abilities that suggested polar bears might be more capable of adapting to changing environmental conditions than previously understood, with both positive and concerning implications for conservation planning. Passenger reactions to the incident varied widely, but were universally profound. Many described the experience as life-changing, providing insights into wildlife intelligence and human-nature relationships that would influence their perspectives for years to come. Others expressed concern about the safety of Arctic tourism and the potential impact of human activities on polar bear behavior. Dr. Andreas Müller, the German glaciologist, reflected on the incident's implications for his own research. Spending time in the Arctic, you develop respect for the intelligence and adaptability of Arctic wildlife. But today's encounter exceeded anything I thought possible. This bear demonstrated problem-solving abilities that suggest we've underestimated the cognitive capabilities of polar bears. The incident also raised questions about the ethics of Arctic tourism and the responsibility of expedition cruise operators to minimize their impact on wildlife behavior. While the aurora borealis had followed all established protocols, the bear's attraction to the ship suggested that even routine operations could influence wildlife in unexpected ways. Captain Eric Haugen faced extensive debriefing sessions with company officials, maritime authorities, and wildlife experts. His handling of the crisis was generally praised, but the incident would influence how expedition cruise ships prepared for and responded to wildlife encounters. In 30 years of Arctic navigation, I've never experienced anything comparable to today's incident, Captain Haugen reflected. The bear's behavior challenged every assumption we had about wildlife encounters. Our crew performed excellently under unprecedented circumstances, but this incident will definitely influence how we prepare for future wildlife situations. The Aurora Borealis continued her cruise itinerary with enhanced wildlife monitoring protocols and modified procedures for food preparation and waste management. The incident had demonstrated the need for increased awareness of how cruise ship operations might influence wildlife behavior, particularly in areas where polar bears were present. Chef Pierre Dubois and his galley staff implemented new protocols for managing cooking aromas and ventilation systems that could attract wildlife attention. We never considered that our cooking might attract polar bears from such distances, Chef Dubois admitted. Now we understand that everything we do in the Arctic can potentially influence wildlife behavior. The ship's galley required extensive repairs to address damage caused by the bear's movement through ventilation systems and his presence in food preparation areas. The repairs were completed during the next scheduled maintenance period, with improvements designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. Dr. Chen and Jonathan Price spent the remainder of the cruise cataloging and analyzing their documentation of the incident. Their preliminary analysis suggested that the bear's behavior represented multiple forms of problem-solving and environmental adaptation that exceeded previous scientific understanding of polar bear cognition. We're looking at behavior that demonstrates planning, spatial reasoning, environmental assessment, and decision-making that rivals the cognitive abilities of many primate species, Dr. Chen explained. This single incident could reshape how we understand polar bear intelligence. The footage captured during the incident would eventually be featured in numerous wildlife documentaries, scientific publications, and educational programs. The bear's systematic investigation of the ship, his problem-solving approach to gaining entry, and his eventual decision to depart voluntarily provided unprecedented insights into polar bear behavior. International wildlife organizations began using the incident to illustrate the complex challenges of managing human-wildlife interactions in a changing Arctic environment. The bear's behavior demonstrated both the remarkable adaptability of Arctic wildlife and the need for increased caution as human activities expanded in polar regions. The incident influenced policy discussions about Arctic tourism regulation, wildlife safety protocols, and the responsibility of tour operators to minimize their impact on wildlife behavior. While no regulations were immediately changed, the incident provided valuable case study material for future policy development. Passenger testimonials from the incident appeared in numerous publications and media outlets, providing personal perspectives on what many described as the wildlife encounter of a lifetime. The consensus among passengers was that the experience had provided profound insights into wildlife intelligence and the complex relationships between humans and the natural world. "I've traveled to every continent and seen wildlife in some of the most remote places on Earth," reflected passenger David Chen, a retired wildlife photographer from San Francisco. "But nothing I've experienced compares to watching that polar bear methodically figure out how to explore our ship. It was humbling to witness such intelligence and adaptability." The scientific papers eventually published based on the incident's documentation would influence polar bear research for decades to come. The behavior captured during the encounter provided evidence for cognitive abilities that required significant revisions to existing understanding of polar bear intelligence and problem-solving capabilities. Dr. Thorne's career was significantly enhanced by her professional management of the crisis. Her expertise and calm leadership during the incident led to consulting opportunities with expedition cruise lines, wildlife management agencies, and Arctic research organizations seeking to improve their wildlife encounter protocols. The polar bear himself became something of a celebrity in the wildlife research community, though he was never directly observed again by researchers. Camera trap studies in the area where he was last seen suggested he had returned to normal polar bear behavior patterns, apparently unaffected by his extraordinary cruise ship adventure. The Aurora Borealis incident, as it came to be known in expedition cruise industry circles, became a case study for wildlife encounter management and a reminder of the intelligence and adaptability of Arctic wildlife. The incident demonstrated both the value of professional wildlife expertise aboard expedition vessels and the need for continued vigilance when operating in environments shared with apex predators. Years later, passengers from the Aurora Borealis would gather annually to commemorate their shared experience and discuss its continuing influence on their perspectives about wildlife and the natural world. Many credited the incident with fundamentally changing their understanding of animal intelligence and their relationship with the natural world. The incident also influenced the career paths of several passengers who became involved in wildlife conservation, Arctic research, or environmental advocacy as a result of their experience. The profound impact of witnessing unprecedented wildlife behavior created lasting commitments to protecting Arctic environments and understanding polar bear ecology. Dr. Chen eventually established a research program focused on polar bear cognition and problem-solving abilities, using the Aurora Borealis incident as a foundation for expanding scientific understanding of polar bear intelligence. Her work would contribute to conservation strategies that recognize the remarkable adaptability and cognitive abilities of Arctic wildlife. Jonathan Pryce's photography from the incident became iconic in wildlife photography circles, with his images featured in exhibitions and publications around the world. His documentation of the bear's behavior provided visual evidence that challenged assumptions about wildlife intelligence and environmental adaptation. The incident's influence on Arctic tourism safety protocols was immediate and lasting. Expedition cruise operators around the world implemented enhanced wildlife monitoring procedures, modified food preparation protocols, and improved crew training for managing unusual wildlife encounters. The Aurora Borealis herself was eventually retired from Arctic service and converted to expedition cruising in Antarctic waters, where her ice-strengthened hull and experienced crew continued providing wildlife encounters in polar environments. Her Arctic legacy was forever linked to the extraordinary polar bear encounter that had challenged understanding of wildlife intelligence and human-nature relationships. The incident continued to influence scientific research, wildlife management policies, and public understanding of polar bear intelligence for decades after the encounter. The bear's unprecedented behavior had provided a window into cognitive abilities that researchers were only beginning to understand, with implications that extended far beyond a single extraordinary day in the Arctic Ocean. In the end, the Aurora Borealis polar bear incident represented more than just an unusual wildlife encounter. It was a reminder of the intelligence, adaptability, and dignity of Arctic wildlife, and a call for increased respect and understanding in human relationships with the natural world. The bear, who had spent several hours exploring a cruise ship, had, in the process, opened new frontiers in scientific understanding and human appreciation for the remarkable creatures that call the Arctic home. The incident would be remembered not just for its drama and unprecedented nature, but for its contribution to expanding human understanding of the intelligence and adaptability of one of the Arctic's most magnificent predators. In demonstrating such remarkable problem-solving abilities and environmental adaptation, the polar bear had taught everyone aboard the Aurora Borealis lessons about wildlife intelligence that would influence their perspectives for the rest of their lives. And somewhere in the vast expanse of the Arctic Ocean, a remarkable polar bear continued his life on the ice, perhaps carrying memories of his own extraordinary adventure aboard a ship full of humans who had learned to see him and his species in an entirely new light. The next story is December 16th, 2024, Grizzly kills newlywed couple during honeymoon hike. The first snowfall of December had transformed the backcountry trails near Glacier National Park into a crystalline wonderland that beckoned adventurous souls with promises of pristine wilderness and untouched beauty. For Daniel and Sarah McKinney, both 27 and married just 3 weeks prior, this winter honeymoon represented the perfect escape from the chaos of wedding planning and the overwhelming transition into married life. They had chosen Montana's rugged landscape specifically because it offered the kind of raw, unfiltered experience that would create memories to last a lifetime, though neither could have imagined just how prophetic that sentiment would prove to be. Daniel McKinney stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with the lean, muscular build of someone who had spent his adult life pursuing outdoor adventures. His sandy brown hair was perpetually tousled from wind and weather, and his green eyes held the kind of restless energy that made sitting still a physical impossibility. Born and raised in Boulder, Colorado, he had earned his living as a freelance outdoor photographer, spending months at a time documenting wildlife and landscapes for national magazines. His Instagram account, at Dan McKinney Outdoors, boasted over 50,000 followers who eagerly consumed his stunning imagery of mountain peaks, rushing rivers, and wildlife encounters. At 27, he had already photographed grizzly bears in Alaska, mountain lions in Utah, and wolves in Yellowstone, always maintaining what he considered a respectful but fearless distance from his subjects. Sarah Elizabeth McKinney, née Patterson, had traded her maiden name just 21 days before their arrival in Montana. Unlike her husband's rugged outdoor background, Sarah had grown up in suburban Minneapolis, where her idea of nature had been limited to well-maintained city parks and the occasional camping trip to state campgrounds with paved roads and shower facilities. Standing 5 feet 6 inches, with shoulder-length auburn hair and warm brown eyes, she possessed an infectious laugh that had first captured Daniel's attention during a chance encounter at a climbing gym in Denver 2 years earlier. Her career as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital Colorado required precision, empathy, and the ability to remain calm under pressure, qualities that had served her well in medical emergencies but had never been tested against the raw indifference of wilderness survival. The couple had met Dr. Marcus Thompson, a 63-year-old wildlife biologist from the University of Montana, during their first evening at the Whitefish Mountain Lodge. Dr. Thompson had spent the better part of 4 decades studying grizzly bear behavior throughout the northern Rockies, and his weathered face bore the accumulated wisdom of countless hours observing these magnificent predators in their natural habitat. His salt and pepper beard and deep-set blue eyes gave him the appearance of someone who had seen both the beauty and brutality of nature in equal measure. When Daniel mentioned their planned hiking route through the Apgar Mountains, Dr. Thompson had paused mid-sip of his whiskey and fixed them with a concerned stare. "December is an unusual time to encounter bears," Dr. Thompson had said, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone who had personally witnessed the aftermath of bear attacks. "Most grizzlies should be denning by now, but climate change has disrupted traditional hibernation patterns. We've documented several cases of delayed denning, particularly among younger males who haven't established territory yet." He had pulled out his smartphone and shown them a series of photographs depicting massive paw prints in snow, claw marks on tree bark, and scat samples that seemed impossibly large. "Just 3 weeks ago, we tracked a 600-pound male through this exact area. Radio collar data shows he's still active, still foraging." Sarah had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air conditioning in the lodge's main dining room. "Should we change our route?" she had asked, unconsciously moving closer to Daniel's reassuring presence. "Not necessarily, Doctor," Thompson had replied, though his tone suggested careful consideration rather than casual dismissal. "Just maintain heightened awareness. Carry bear spray, multiple canisters. Make noise on blind corners. Most importantly, if you encounter a grizzly, do not run. Back away slowly, avoid direct eye contact, and speak in calm, low tones. Running triggers their chase instinct, and they can reach speeds of 35 miles per hour through snow." James Rodriguez, the lodge's senior guide, had joined their conversation as closing time approached. At 45, James possessed the kind of mountain wisdom that came from spending 23 years leading tourists and researchers through some of Montana's most challenging terrain. His weathered hands bore scars from rope burns, rockfall, and one memorable encounter with a wolverine, while his dark eyes held the perpetual vigilance of someone who understood that nature demanded constant respect. Born in Kalispell to a family of loggers, James had learned to read weather patterns, animal behavior, and trail conditions with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural. "The McKinneys are planning the Apgar Ridge Trail, Doctor," Thompson had informed James, who immediately frowned and pulled out a well-worn topographic map covered in pencil marks, GPS coordinates, and weather-resistant tape. "That's a beautiful route," James had acknowledged, tracing the trail with a calloused finger. 12 miles of moderate terrain, elevation gain of about 2,800 feet, spectacular views of Lake McDonald and the Continental Divide. But it's also prime grizzly habitat, dense huckleberry stands, salmon spawning areas, and natural corridors that bears use for seasonal migration. He had looked directly at Sarah, perhaps recognizing her as the less experienced hiker. "Have you done much winter hiking?" "Some," Sarah had replied, though her definition of winter hiking had involved well-marked trails in Colorado's Front Range, complete with trail markers every quarter mile and emergency shelters at regular intervals. James had spent the next hour outlining essential safety protocols, checking weather conditions hourly, carrying emergency communication devices, establishing predetermined turnaround times, and maintaining constant awareness of wind direction to avoid surprising wildlife. He had also provided them with detailed maps marking known bear activity areas, emergency cache locations, and the precise GPS coordinates of ranger stations and emergency shelters along their intended route. The morning of December 14th had dawned clear and cold, with temperatures hovering around 18 degrees Fahrenheit and a light snow falling that created perfect tracking conditions. Daniel had awakened before sunrise, his internal clock still adjusted to the photographer's golden hour, and had spent 30 minutes checking and rechecking their gear while Sarah enjoyed an extra hour of sleep. Their equipment list read like a serious mountaineering expedition: lightweight winter camping gear, emergency shelter, first aid supplies, water purification tablets, high-calorie emergency food, GPS devices with satellite communication capability, avalanche beacons, and 3 canisters of maximum strength bear spray. Eleanor Hayes, the lodge's morning desk clerk, had processed their trail registration with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that had prevented numerous search and rescue operations over her 15-year career. At 58, Eleanor possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local trail conditions, weather patterns, and the subtle signs that separated well-prepared hikers from potential rescue statistics. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her wire-rimmed glasses reflected the kind of intelligence that came from processing thousands of permit applications and emergency reports. "Expected return date?" Eleanor had asked, her pen poised over the official registration form. "December 16th by 6 p.m., Daniel had replied confidently, consulting the detailed itinerary he had prepared weeks in advance. Emergency contacts. Sarah had provided her sister Jennifer's information, while Daniel had listed his brother Michael, both of whom had received detailed copies of their hiking plans, GPS coordinates, and emergency procedures. Eleanor had also recorded the make, model, and license plate number of their rental vehicle, a red Ford Explorer with studded winter tires, which would remain parked at the Apgar Creek trailhead throughout their 3-day adventure. Dr. Rachel Morrison, a local meteorologist who provided daily weather briefings for the Park Service, had delivered a sobering forecast during their final safety briefing. Standing 5 feet 4 inches with steel grey hair and intense blue eyes, Dr. Morrison had earned her reputation through 32 years of accurately predicting mountain weather patterns that had saved countless lives and prevented numerous search and rescue operations. Current conditions show a high-pressure system moving through the region, Dr. Morrison had explained, pointing to a large-scale weather map covered in isobars, frontal boundaries, and temperature gradients. Temperatures will remain stable through December 15th, with minimal precipitation and light winds from the northwest. However, a significant low-pressure system is approaching from the Pacific, expected to arrive late on December 16th. Daniel had studied the forecast maps with the intensity of someone whose livelihood depended on understanding weather patterns. "What kind of system are we talking about?" "Potentially severe," Dr. Morrison had replied without hesitation. "Snowfall rates of 2 to 3 inches per hour, sustained winds of 25 to 35 miles per hour with gusts up to 50, and temperature drops of 15 to 20 degrees within a 6-hour period. Visibility could drop to near zero, and avalanche danger will increase significantly on slopes steeper than 30 degrees. The information had prompted a lengthy discussion about contingency plans, emergency procedures, and the wisdom of attempting their planned route given the approaching storm system. Ultimately, they had decided to proceed with their original itinerary while maintaining flexibility to cut their trip short if conditions deteriorated more rapidly than forecast. At 8:30 a.m. on December 14th, Daniel and Sarah had stood at the Apgar Creek trailhead, surrounded by towering Douglas fir and western red cedar trees whose branches bore the weight of fresh snow like natural Christmas decorations. The parking area, which accommodated overflow crowds during summer months, held only their rental vehicle and a Park Service truck belonging to Ranger Patricia Williams, who had arrived to conduct a final equipment check and safety briefing. Ranger Williams, a 39-year-old Montana native with 15 years of Park Service experience, possessed the kind of practical wilderness knowledge that had saved numerous lives throughout her career. Her olive drab uniform bore patches indicating certifications in wilderness first aid, technical rescue, and wildlife management, while her utility belt contained everything from emergency medical supplies to specialized equipment for handling dangerous wildlife encounters. Standing 5 feet 8 inches, with short brown hair and hazel eyes that missed nothing, she had earned a reputation among both colleagues and visitors for thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. "Let's review your gear one more time," Ranger Williams had said, despite having already approved their equipment list during the permit process. She had methodically examined each piece of their equipment, testing the functionality of their GPS devices, checking expiration dates on emergency food supplies, verifying the proper operation of their satellite communication beacon, and ensuring that their bear spray canisters were easily accessible and properly secured. Bear spray deployment technique, she had continued, removing one of their canisters and demonstrating proper grip, stance, and aiming procedures. Effective range is approximately 30 feet, but accuracy decreases significantly beyond 20 feet. Wind direction is critical. Never deploy bear spray with a crosswind that might blow it back toward you. Create a wall of spray between yourself and the bear, then back away slowly while the bear is distracted. Sarah had practiced the deployment sequence 3 times, her medical training helping her maintain steady hands despite the gravity of the situation. What if there's more than one bear? Extremely unlikely, Ranger Williams had replied, though her tone suggested she was covering all possibilities rather than dismissing concerns. Grizzlies are typically solitary except during mating season or when sows have cubs. However, if you encounter multiple bears, focus your spray on the most aggressive individual while maintaining awareness of the others' positions. The first day of their adventure had unfolded exactly as planned, with the couple covering approximately 4 miles of well-marked trail through increasingly spectacular scenery. The Apgar Creek Trail began as a gentle grade through mixed forest, where enormous Douglas fir trees created natural cathedrals with their interlocking branches. Fresh snow had transformed the landscape into something from a fantasy novel, with every surface outlined in white and the sound of their footsteps muffled to whispered crunches. Daniel had stopped frequently to photograph the stunning winter wonderland, his professional-grade camera capturing images that would later appear in outdoor magazines and social media feeds viewed by thousands of followers. His telephoto lens had documented distant mountain peaks emerging from cloud cover, intricate frost patterns on evergreen needles, and Sarah's delighted expressions as she experienced true wilderness for the first time in her life. "This is incredible," Sarah had breathed during one of their rest stops, her words creating small clouds of vapor in the frigid air. "I never imagined anywhere could be this beautiful." Their first night's campsite had been located at mile 4.7, situated on a small rise overlooking a frozen meadow where the remains of summer wildflowers created abstract patterns beneath the snow cover. Following established protocols, they had erected their 4-season tent on level ground, secured all food items in bear-proof containers, suspended 15 feet above ground and 4 feet from any tree trunk, and established a cooking area 100 yards downwind from their sleeping quarters. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit by midnight, but their high-quality sleeping bags and insulated sleeping pads had maintained comfortable warmth throughout the night. Sarah had awakened twice to the sound of wind through the trees, a constant whispered rushing that reminded her of ocean waves, but carried undertones of wilderness that her suburban upbringing had never prepared her to interpret. December 15th had dawned clear and cold, with brilliant sunshine creating diamond-like sparkles across the snow-covered landscape, and visibility extending for dozens of miles in every direction. Their planned route for the second day would take them across the most challenging terrain of their entire trip. a series of steep switchbacks ascending the eastern face of Apgar Ridge, followed by a traverse across exposed alpine terrain where the tree line gave way to stark rock formations and panoramic views of the surrounding mountain ranges. At 7 a.m., they had broken camp with the efficiency of experienced outdoor enthusiasts, packing their gear according to weight distribution principles that Daniel had learned during his photography expeditions, and Sarah had absorbed through intensive pre-trip research. Their backpacks, loaded with approximately 35 pounds of gear each, felt manageable during the early morning hours when their energy levels remained high and the trail conditions remained favorable. The ascent to Apgar Ridge had proven more challenging than either had anticipated, with elevation gain becoming noticeable around mile 6 and the effects of altitude beginning to impact their breathing and energy levels. At 8,500 feet above sea level, the air contained approximately 25% less oxygen than Sarah's body was accustomed to at her Minneapolis home near sea level. Daniel, having spent years photographing in Colorado's high country, had adapted more quickly to the reduced oxygen levels, but had maintained a pace that accommodated Sarah's gradual acclimatization. "Remember to hydrate frequently," Daniel had reminded her during one of their hourly rest stops, consulting the detailed checklist that James Rodriguez had provided during their final briefing. "Dehydration happens faster at altitude, especially in cold weather, when you don't feel thirsty." By noon, they had reached the exposed ridgeline that represented the highest point of their intended route, standing at 9,200 feet above sea level, with 360-degree views that stretched from the Canadian border to the south and encompassed dozens of named and unnamed peaks throughout the northern Rockies. The wind at this elevation had cut through their carefully selected clothing layers with surgical precision, requiring frequent adjustments to their gear and constant monitoring of their extremities for signs of frostbite. Daniel had spent 45 minutes photographing the spectacular vistas, using various focal lengths and exposure settings to capture both sweeping panoramas and intimate details of wind-sculpted snow formations. His professional training had taught him to work quickly in challenging conditions, and he had managed to document the breathtaking scenery while maintaining awareness of weather conditions and the need to reach their second night's campsite before darkness fell. "Weather's changing," Sarah had observed around 2 p.m., pointing toward a bank of dark clouds that had appeared on the western horizon while they had been focused on photography and route finding. "Those clouds weren't there an hour ago." Daniel had consulted his GPS device and the detailed topographic maps that James Rodriguez had annotated with local weather pattern information. "We're about 2 miles from tonight's campsite. Should be manageable even if the weather moves in faster than forecast." Their second night's destination had been a designated camping area at mile 8.3, located in a grove of massive mountain hemlock trees that provided natural windbreaks and established fire rings for heating and cooking. The site sat at approximately 880 feet elevation, positioned on a natural bench that offered protection from prevailing winds while maintaining access to a reliable water source from a small creek that remained unfrozen due to its constant movement and relatively warm underground springs. As they had descended from the exposed ridgeline toward their campsite, the approaching weather system had become increasingly apparent through subtle changes in wind direction, air pressure, and the quality of light filtering through the increasingly thick cloud cover. The temperature had dropped noticeably during their descent, falling from the 22 degrees they had experienced on the ridge to approximately 16 degrees in the more sheltered areas of dense forest. At 4:30 p.m., they had arrived at their designated camping area to discover that they would not be alone in the wilderness. Fresh tracks in the snow told the story of recent visitors that had not appeared on any trail registration forms or permit applications. The prints measured approximately 11 inches in length and 6 inches in width, with clearly visible claw marks extending 3 to 4 inches beyond the toe impressions. The stride length between prints indicated an animal moving at a casual walking pace, and the depth of the impressions suggested a weight that exceeded anything that belonged in the same ecosystem as two humans with minimal wilderness experience. Bear tracks, Daniel had said unnecessarily, his voice carrying a tone that tried to project calm while betraying underlying tension. He had photographed similar tracks during his professional assignments, but seeing them in person while miles from the nearest road or ranger station created an entirely different emotional response. Sarah had stared at the prints with the kind of fascination that comes from encountering something simultaneously magnificent and terrifying. How recent? Hard to tell exactly, Daniel had replied, kneeling beside the clearest impression and examining the edges of the track for signs of weathering or fill-in from wind-blown snow. The snow stopped falling around noon, and these prints show no accumulation, so they're definitely from this afternoon, maybe within the last few hours. They had spent the next 30 minutes conducting a thorough survey of their immediate camping area, discovering additional sign that painted a detailed picture of recent bear activity. Claw marks on several large trees indicated a bear had been testing bark and possibly marking territory, while scat deposits containing the remains of huckleberries, pine nuts, and what appeared to be small mammal fur suggested an animal that had been feeding extensively in preparation for winter denning. "Should we relocate?" Sarah had asked, though their options remained limited given the approaching darkness, deteriorating weather conditions, and the fact that their next potential camping area lay another 4 miles further along the trail. Daniel had weighed their alternatives while consulting the emergency procedures that Ranger Williams had reviewed during their final safety briefing. This is an established camping area with food storage facilities and emergency equipment caches. Moving now might put us in a worse position if the weather hits harder than forecast. Their decision to remain at the designated campsite had been influenced by several practical considerations. The site offered natural windbreaks and shelter from the approaching storm, established protocols for food storage and waste management, and proximity to emergency supply caches that could prove critical if conditions deteriorated beyond their ability to continue hiking. Additionally, their satellite communication device showed strong signal strength from this location, ensuring their ability to contact search and rescue services if circumstances required emergency assistance. Following bear safety protocols with meticulous attention to detail that would have impressed Ranger Williams, they had established their camp in a triangular configuration that separated sleeping, cooking, and food storage areas by at least 100 yards each. Their tent had been positioned on the most level and protected ground available, while their designated cooking area had been located downwind to prevent food odors from attracting curious wildlife during the night. The process of securing their food supplies had required nearly an hour of careful preparation, with every item that contained even trace amounts of scent, including toiletries, toothpaste, soap, and first aid supplies, being sealed in multiple layers of odor-proof containers before being suspended 15 feet above ground and 4 feet from the nearest tree trunk. The bear-proof containers had been tested and certified by the National Park Service for effectiveness against even the most persistent and intelligent grizzly bears. As darkness had fallen around 6 p.m., the approaching storm system had announced its arrival through increasingly frequent wind gusts and the first tentative snowflakes that would soon develop into the blizzard that Dr. Morrison had predicted. The temperature had dropped another 8 degrees during the 30 minutes between sunset and full darkness, and their thermometer had registered 4 degrees Fahrenheit when they had finally sealed themselves inside their tent for the night. "At least we'll have an adventure story to tell," Sarah had said, as they had settled into their sleeping bags, her optimistic nature asserting itself despite the challenging conditions and evidence of large predators in their immediate vicinity. Daniel had smiled at his wife's resilience while performing one final check of their emergency equipment. GPS devices with fresh batteries, satellite communication beacon with emergency contact information, bear spray canisters positioned for immediate access, and detailed evacuation plans that accounted for various emergency scenarios. "Best honeymoon ever," he had replied, though he had found himself listening intently to every sound from outside their tent throughout the long, cold night. The blizzard had arrived with the punctuality that Dr. Morrison's forecast had predicted, beginning as scattered snowflakes around 8 p.m. and developing into a full-scale storm by midnight. Wind speeds had increased steadily throughout the night, creating a constant background noise that masked the subtle sounds that might have warned them of approaching danger. By morning, nearly 18 inches of fresh snow had accumulated on their tent, and the temperature had dropped to -6 degrees Fahrenheit, with sustained winds of 30 miles per hour. December 16th had dawned grey and ominous, with heavy cloud cover that eliminated any possibility of sunshine and reduced visibility to less than 50 yards in any direction. The storm had transformed their pristine winter wonderland into something far more sinister. A white void where familiar landmarks disappeared behind curtains of wind-driven snow, and every direction looked identical to every other direction. "Weather's worse than forecast," Daniel had observed as he had struggled to zip their tent closed against the wind that had threatened to tear the fabric from its stakes. "We need to make a decision about whether to continue or head back." Their original plan had called for breaking camp early and covering the final 4 miles to their intended exit point at the Camas Creek trailhead, where their rental vehicle would be waiting in the parking area they had arranged with the Park Service. However, the current conditions had made navigation extremely challenging and potentially dangerous, especially given the exposure they would face during the final 2 miles of trail that traversed open slopes above the tree line. Sarah had consulted their GPS devices while Daniel had monitored weather reports on their satellite communication beacon, hoping for updated forecasts that might indicate improving conditions. The news had not been encouraging. The storm system had intensified beyond Dr. Morrison's predictions and was expected to continue throughout the day, with snowfall rates of 3 to 4 inches per hour and wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. "Emergency protocols suggest we should stay put until conditions improve," Sarah had said, reading from the laminated safety cards that Ranger Williams had provided during their permit process. "Attempting to navigate in these conditions increases the risk of getting lost or injured." Their decision to remain at their campsite for an additional day had been the correct choice from a safety perspective. But it had also meant staying in an area where they knew a large bear had been active just hours before their arrival. Throughout the morning, they had maintained heightened awareness of their surroundings while conducting necessary camp maintenance activities and monitoring weather conditions for signs of improvement. At approximately 11 a.m., while Sarah had been melting snow for drinking water using their portable camp stove, Daniel had noticed movement in the tree line approximately 70 yards from their tent. The falling snow and limited visibility had made it difficult to identify exactly what he had seen, but the size and movement pattern had been unlike anything that belonged in a winter forest ecosystem populated primarily by small mammals and birds. "Sarah," he had said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled tension that immediately captured her attention despite the background noise of wind and weather. She had followed his gaze toward the tree line, where a dark shape had become visible through the swirling snow, moving with the purposeful gait of a large predator investigating an area that contained novel scents and sounds. The animal had been massive, easily 6 feet in length and standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, with the distinctive humped profile and dish-shaped face that identified it unmistakably as a mature grizzly bear. "Bear spray," Sarah had whispered. her medical training helping her maintain calm while adrenaline had flooded her system and triggered every survival instinct her body possessed. Daniel had slowly reached for the nearest canister of bear spray while maintaining visual contact with the animal and avoiding any sudden movements that might trigger aggressive behavior. The bear had appeared to be investigating their scent trail rather than actively stalking them, but its proximity to their campsite and the intensity of its focus had created a situation that required immediate and careful response. For nearly 10 minutes, they had watched the massive grizzly move through their camping area with the casual confidence of an apex predator that had never encountered a threat capable of challenging its dominance. The bear had investigated their food storage area, sniffing extensively around the base of the tree where their bear-proof containers had been suspended, before moving toward their cooking area where traces of food odors might have remained despite their careful cleanup procedures. "It's just investigating," Daniel had whispered, though his grip on the bear spray had remained firm, and his body had been positioned to shield Sarah if the situation had escalated, not showing aggressive behavior. The bear had spent another 5 minutes examining their camp before slowly moving away through the forest, disappearing into the falling snow with the same ghostly silence that had marked its arrival. For the next hour, they had remained in a state of heightened alert, knowing that the animal remained somewhere in their immediate vicinity and might return at any time. "That was probably the bear whose tracks we found yesterday," Sarah had said once her heart rate had returned to something approaching normal. "Maybe it considers this part of its territory." Their encounter with the grizzly had fundamentally changed the dynamic of their wilderness experience, transforming what had been an adventure vacation into a situation that required constant vigilance and emergency preparedness. They had spent the remainder of the day monitoring their surroundings while waiting for weather conditions to improve enough to allow a safe passage to their exit point. As afternoon had turned to evening, the storm had shown no signs of abating, and their weather radio had continued to broadcast warnings about dangerous conditions throughout the region. National Weather Service reports had indicated that the storm system had stalled over the northern Rockies and was expected to continue producing heavy snow and high winds through at least the following morning. "We need to check in," Sarah had said around 4 p.m., referring to their predetermined communication schedule with the Park Service and their emergency contacts. "Jennifer will be expecting to hear from us." Daniel had activated their satellite communication beacon and composed a brief message explaining their situation. Safe but weathered in due to severe storm conditions, planning to remain at current location until conditions improved. Estimated departure for exit trailhead the following morning, if weather permitted. The message had been transmitted successfully to both the Park Service and their designated emergency contacts, providing reassurance that they remained safe while buying additional time for the storm to clear. As darkness had approached on their third night in the wilderness, they had conducted another thorough security check of their campsite, ensuring that all food items remained properly secured and that their bear spray remained easily accessible. The fresh snow had covered any tracks from their morning visitor, but they had maintained the assumption that the bear remained somewhere in their vicinity and could return at any time. "One more night," Daniel had said as they had settled into their tent for what they had hoped would be their final evening in the wilderness. "Tomorrow, we'll be back at the lodge with hot showers and room service." Neither of them had slept well that night, partly due to the constant noise of wind and blowing snow, but mostly because of an underlying tension that had settled over their campsite since the morning's bear encounter. Every sound from outside their tent had caused momentary alertness, and both had found themselves listening for the subtle indicators that might warn of approaching danger. The attack had come without warning at 5:15 a.m. on December 17th, while both of them had been dozing fitfully in their sleeping bags, and the storm had continued to rage outside their tent with undiminished fury. The first indication of danger had been a sound that Sarah's medical training had taught her to recognize, the distinctive tearing of fabric that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. The bear had approached their tent during the pre-dawn darkness with the silence that only a perfectly adapted predator could achieve, moving across the snow-covered ground without creating any sound that might have alerted them to its presence. The first contact between the massive grizzly and their shelter had been a single swipe of its front paw that had torn through the rainfly and tent body as if they had been constructed of tissue paper. What was that? Sarah had whispered in the darkness, though some primitive part of her brain had already recognized the sound and begun flooding her system with adrenaline. The second swipe had removed an entire section of their tent wall, exposing them to the full fury of the blizzard while simultaneously revealing the massive form of the grizzly bear that had been investigating their campsite for the past 24 hours. In the dim light of their emergency flashlight, the animal had appeared even larger than it had during their daylight encounter, its dark fur covered with snow, and its small eyes reflecting the light with an intelligence that had been both magnificent and terrifying. Daniel had reached for the bear spray with movements that had been deliberately slow and controlled, knowing that sudden motion might trigger the predatory response that could transform a curious investigation into a deadly attack. The canister had been positioned exactly where emergency protocols had dictated, within arm's reach, but secured against accidental deployment. "Easy," he had said, in the low, calm tone that every wilderness safety course had recommended for bear encounters. "We're not a threat." The grizzly had paused for a moment that had seemed to last for hours, its massive head turning slightly as it had processed the sounds and scents that had indicated the presence of humans in what it had clearly considered its territory. The bear's body language had shown curiosity rather than aggression, but its sheer size and power had made the distinction academic. Even a playful interaction with a 600-pound predator could easily prove fatal for the humans involved. When the bear had moved closer to investigate their tent more thoroughly, Daniel had made the decision that wilderness safety experts had debated for decades, whether to use bear spray preemptively or wait until the animal showed clear signs of aggressive intent. His choice to deploy the spray while the bear had remained approximately 15 feet away had been based on the confined space of their partially destroyed tent and the limited options for retreat. The bear spray had functioned exactly as designed, creating a dense cloud of capsaicin-based irritant that had immediately caused the grizzly to retreat, with huffing sounds that had indicated discomfort rather than rage. The massive animal had backed away from their tent, shaking its head and pawing at its face, while the chemical irritant had done its work, providing them with the opportunity to escape from their compromised shelter. "Go, go, go!" Daniel had shouted, though the wind had nearly drowned out his voice as they had scrambled through the torn opening of their tent and into the full fury of the blizzard. Their escape from the immediate danger had been facilitated by the bear's temporary disorientation from the spray, but it had also thrust them into weather conditions that had posed their own life-threatening challenges. The temperature had been -8 degrees Fahrenheit, with sustained winds of 35 miles per hour, creating a wind chill factor that had approached -40 degrees and making exposure potentially fatal within minutes. Sarah had grabbed their emergency pack while Daniel had secured their GPS devices and satellite communication beacon, knowing that their survival had depended on their ability to navigate to safety while maintaining core body temperature in conditions that had exceeded the design parameters of their winter clothing. The blowing snow had reduced visibility to less than 10 feet in any direction, transforming the familiar landscape of their campsite into an alien environment where every direction had looked identical. "Emergency shelter!" Sarah had shouted over the wind, referring to the survival protocols they had memorized during their pre-trip preparation. "We need to get out of this wind." Their movement away from the compromised campsite had been guided by their GPS devices and their memory of the surrounding terrain. But the storm conditions had made navigation extremely challenging, even with electronic assistance. The fresh snow had covered all familiar landmarks, and the wind had created disorienting noise that had made it difficult to maintain their sense of direction. Behind them, the grizzly had recovered from the effects of the bear spray and had begun following their trail through the snow, with the persistence that had made these animals successful predators for thousands of years. The bear's superior size and natural adaptations had allowed it to move through the deep snow far more efficiently than the two humans struggling through drifts that had reached their knees in some areas. "It's following us," Daniel had observed during a brief pause to check their position and assess their situation. Their GPS devices had shown that they had traveled approximately 300 yards from their original campsite, but they had remained well within the bear's established territory and far from any form of assistance or shelter. The pursuit had continued for nearly 2 hours, with the massive grizzly maintaining a distance of 50 to 70 yards while following their trail through increasingly difficult terrain. The bear's behavior had suggested territorial defense rather than predatory hunting, but the practical result had been the same. Two exhausted humans being driven through life-threatening weather conditions by a 600-pound predator that had shown no signs of abandoning its pursuit. As hypothermia had begun to affect their judgment and coordination, their ability to maintain the pace necessary to stay ahead of the bear had deteriorated rapidly. Sarah's hands had become numb despite her insulated gloves, and Daniel's feet had lost sensation that had made walking on uneven terrain increasingly dangerous. The emergency shelter they had been seeking had remained elusive, and their GPS devices had indicated that they had been moving away from established trails rather than towards safety. "Can't keep this up," Sarah had gasped during one of their increasingly frequent rest stops, her medical training allowing her to recognize the early symptoms of hypothermia in both herself and her husband. The final confrontation had occurred in a small clearing where the wind had been less severe and visibility had improved slightly, allowing them to see the approaching bear more clearly than at any point during their ordeal. The grizzly had been massive beyond anything their wildlife safety courses had prepared them to encounter. An apex predator in perfect physical condition whose very presence had dwarfed every other consideration about wilderness survival or emergency preparedness. Daniel had deployed their second canister of bear spray when the animal had approached within 20 feet, but the wind conditions had reduced the effectiveness of the chemical deterrent and had blown a significant portion of the spray back toward them. The grizzly had been affected by the capsaicin, but had not retreated as dramatically as during their first encounter, suggesting either tolerance developed from the previous exposure or determination that had overcome the temporary discomfort. "The beacon," Sarah had said, her voice barely audible over the wind as she had activated their satellite emergency communicator and transmitted their final distress signal to search and rescue authorities. The GPS coordinates transmitted by their emergency beacon had been received by the National Park Service Emergency Communication Center at exactly 7:42 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, triggering an immediate response from multiple agencies, including park rangers, local search and rescue teams, and the Montana National Guard helicopter unit that had been standing by due to the severe weather conditions throughout the region. Ranger Patricia Williams had been monitoring emergency communications from the Park Service headquarters when the distress signal had been received, and she had immediately recognized the coordinates as corresponding to the remote area where the McKinney couple had been registered for their 3-day hiking permit. The combination of severe weather conditions and the couple's failure to check in at their scheduled time had already placed them on the watch list for potential search and rescue operations. "We have an active emergency beacon in the Apgar Ridge area," Williams had announced to the emergency response team that had been assembled since before dawn due to the deteriorating weather conditions and the number of overdue hiking parties throughout the park. GPS coordinates place them approximately 4 miles from their registered exit point, in an area known for recent bear activity. Dr. Thompson had been present at the Emergency Coordination Center as part of the wildlife management team that had been tracking the movements of several radio-collared bears throughout the region, and his expertise had immediately been called upon to assess the potential for human-wildlife conflict in the emergency area. His computer database had shown that a mature male grizzly, designated as Bear 417, had been active in the exact area where the distress signal had originated. Bear 417 is a 6-year-old male, approximately 600 pounds, who has shown increasingly bold behavior around human activity areas, Dr. Thompson had reported to the assembled emergency response team. Radio collar data shows he has been in this area for the past 72 hours and has not yet entered winter denning. The weather conditions that had been preventing the McKinneys from completing their planned hike had also been grounding the helicopter resources that represented the fastest and most effective means of reaching remote emergency locations throughout the park. Chief Pilot Michael Stevens of the Montana National Guard had been monitoring conditions throughout the night, waiting for the brief weather windows that might allow emergency flight operations. Visibility is marginal and winds are exceeding safe flight parameters, Stevens had reported during the emergency briefing. We might get a short window around noon if this front moves through as predicted, but any flight operations will be extremely high risk. James Rodriguez had volunteered to lead the ground-based search and rescue team that would attempt to reach the emergency coordinates on foot, despite the challenging conditions that had made hiking potentially dangerous even for experienced mountain rescue specialists. His team had included 6 additional rescuers with specialized training in winter wilderness operations, medical emergency response, and wildlife conflict resolution. Ground team departure in 15 minutes, Rodriguez had announced, while checking equipment that had included emergency medical supplies, additional bear spray, emergency shelter materials, and communication equipment that would maintain contact with the coordination center throughout the rescue operation. At the emergency site, the situation had deteriorated beyond anything that wilderness safety training had prepared them to handle. The grizzly bear had continued its territorial defense of the area despite multiple deployments of bear spray, and the storm conditions had prevented any realistic possibility of escape to safety. Both Daniel and Sarah had been showing advanced symptoms of hypothermia, including confusion, coordination problems, and the dangerous lethargy that preceded complete collapse. "Stay together," Daniel had managed to say during what would prove to be their final coherent conversation, though the storm had made even basic communication nearly impossible. The emergency beacon had continued transmitting their GPS coordinates every 10 minutes, providing search and rescue teams with real-time location data, but also documenting the tragic progression of events as the transmission signal had gradually weakened throughout the morning hours. The final transmission had been received at 11:23 a.m., after which the device had either been damaged, depleted of battery power, or buried beneath accumulating snow. James Rodriguez and his ground-based rescue team had reached the couple's original campsite at 12:15 p.m., fighting through snowdrifts and wind conditions that had pushed the limits of what experienced mountain rescue specialists could safely navigate. The destroyed tent and scattered equipment had told the story of the initial bear encounter, while the trail leading away from the campsite had provided clear evidence of the pursuit that had followed. "Fresh bear tracks," Rodriguez had reported via radio to the Emergency Coordination Center. "Multiple sets of human footprints being followed by a large bear. Trail heads northwest toward Avalanche Creek drainage." The rescue team had followed the trail for approximately 1 mile before discovering the first evidence of the tragedy that had unfolded throughout the morning hours. Sarah's backpack had been found torn and partially buried in snow, its contents scattered across a small clearing where the tracks had indicated a prolonged struggle had taken place. "We have equipment here," Rodriguez had radioed, his voice carrying the grim tone that experienced rescue workers develop when hopes for a successful rescue begin to fade. "Backpack, sleeping bag, and what appears to be blood in the snow." Dr. Thompson had arrived at the scene via helicopter during a brief break in the weather conditions, bringing specialized equipment for wildlife tracking and the tranquilizer weapons that might be necessary to safely approach the area if the bear remained in the vicinity. His examination of the tracks and sign had confirmed their worst fears about the size and behavior of the animal they were dealing with. "This is definitely Bear 417, Dr. Thompson had reported after examining claw marks on nearby trees and measuring the track impressions. Radio collar data shows he has remained in this area continuously since yesterday evening. The behavioral pattern suggests territorial defense rather than predatory behavior, but the result is the same." The discovery of Daniel's camera equipment 50 yards from Sarah's backpack had provided additional evidence of the desperate struggle that had taken place throughout the morning. The camera's memory card, protected by its weatherproof housing, had contained a final series of photographs taken during the bear encounter that had documented both the massive size of the animal and the deteriorating weather conditions that had prevented escape. The last photos were taken at 7:51 a.m., Rodriguez had reported after reviewing the camera's digital timestamp. They show the bear at close range, maybe 15 to 20 feet. Weather conditions appear even worse than what we're dealing with now. The search for the couple themselves had continued throughout the afternoon, with additional ground teams and aerial resources being deployed as weather conditions had permitted. The trail had led through increasingly difficult terrain, including areas where avalanche danger had required extreme caution and specialized route-finding skills. At 3:47 p.m., Ranger Williams had discovered what remained of their campsite's food storage area, where the bear-proof containers had been torn open with a force that had demonstrated the animal's incredible power and persistence. The scattered remains of their emergency food supplies had indicated that the bear had spent considerable time at this location, possibly while the couple had been struggling through the storm somewhere else in its territory. "The bear has been feeding here," Williams had radioed to the coordination center. "Food containers are completely destroyed. This animal has lost all fear of human scent and activity." The final discovery had been made at 4:21 p.m. by helicopter crew members during a brief clearing in the weather that had allowed aerial reconnaissance of areas too dangerous for ground teams to access. Chief Pilot Stevens had spotted bright orange fabric, consistent with the emergency clothing that both hikers had been wearing, in a ravine approximately 2 miles from their original campsite. "We have visual on possible victims," Stevens had reported, though the helicopter's position and weather conditions had prevented immediate recovery operations. 2 individuals in a ravine below tree line, no movement visible. The recovery operation had required an additional 4 hours due to the technical challenges of accessing the ravine in severe weather conditions and the presence of Bear 417, who had remained in the immediate area and had shown aggressive behavior toward the approaching rescue teams. Dr. Thompson had been forced to use tranquilizer equipment to sedate the animal before recovery operations could proceed safely. "Bear is down," Dr. Thompson had reported at 6:15 p.m. "Recovery teams can proceed, but we have limited time before the animal recovers consciousness." The scene that had greeted the recovery team had provided tragic confirmation of the events that had unfolded throughout the day. Both Daniel and Sarah McKinney had succumbed to a combination of hypothermia and injuries sustained during their encounter with the massive grizzly bear. Their bodies had been found together, indicating that they had maintained contact with each other until the end of their ordeal. Recovery complete, Rodriguez had reported at 7:32 p.m. as the helicopter had lifted off from the ravine with the couple's remains. Victims are being transported to Glacier County Medical Examiner's office for official determination of cause of death. The official investigation that had followed the tragedy had involved multiple agencies, including the National Park Service, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the Glacier County Sheriff's Department, and federal wildlife authorities. Dr. Thompson had led the wildlife portion of the investigation, which had included comprehensive analysis of Bear 417's behavior patterns, radio collar data, and the decision-making process that had led to the tragic encounter. This represents a complex case of wildlife behavior that resulted from multiple contributing factors, Dr. Thompson had written in his official report. Climate change has disrupted normal denning patterns, leading to increased human-wildlife conflicts during typically low-risk periods. Bear 417 had established territorial behavior in an area that contained established camping facilities, creating a situation where conflict became nearly inevitable. The medical examiner's report had determined that both victims had died from a combination of severe hypothermia and trauma consistent with a bear attack, though the hypothermia had likely been the primary cause of death in both cases. The extreme weather conditions that had prevented their escape had ultimately proven more deadly than their encounter with the grizzly bear itself. Time of death estimated between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. on December 17th, the medical examiner had concluded. Contributing factors include exposure to extreme weather conditions, exhaustion from prolonged physical exertion, and stress from wildlife encounter. Bear 417 had been euthanized following the incident, despite protests from wildlife advocates who had argued that the animal had been exhibiting natural territorial behavior rather than abnormal aggression. Dr. Thompson had supported the decision based on the bear's demonstrated lack of fear toward humans and the risk it would pose to future visitors to the area. Once a bear loses its natural fear of humans and associates human activity areas with territorial behavior, it becomes a permanent threat to public safety, Dr. Thompson had explained during the media briefings that had followed the incident. Relocation is not effective with animals that have established such strong site fidelity. Leaders. The tragedy had prompted comprehensive reviews of wilderness safety protocols, emergency response procedures, and the communication systems used to track and assist backcountry visitors throughout Glacier National Park. Ranger Williams had led a team that had developed enhanced safety requirements for winter hiking permits, including mandatory satellite communication devices and more frequent check-in schedules. This incident highlights the need for better integration between wildlife monitoring systems and visitor safety protocols, Williams had written in her after-action report. Real-time bear activity data should be incorporated into permit decisions and emergency response planning. The lodge where Daniel and Sarah had spent their final night in civilization had established a memorial fund in their honor, supporting wilderness safety education and bear behavior research programs throughout the Northern Rockies. Eleanor Hayes had maintained their original registration paperwork as a reminder of how quickly wilderness adventures could transform into tragedies, despite careful planning and appropriate preparation. They did everything right, Hayes had told reporters during the media coverage that had followed the incident. They had proper equipment, emergency communication devices, and detailed safety plans. Sometimes the wilderness simply overwhelms even the best preparations. Dr. Morrison had revised her weather forecasting protocols for winter mountain conditions, incorporating additional safety margins and more conservative recommendations for backcountry travel during periods of rapidly changing weather patterns. Her analysis of the storm system that had trapped the McKinneys had led to improved prediction models that had already prevented several similar incidents throughout the region. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more severe, Dr. Morrison had explained during a conference on wilderness safety planning. Our safety protocols need to evolve to match the changing environmental conditions that visitors will encounter in mountain environments. The satellite communication beacon that had transmitted their final distress signal had been recovered and analyzed by the manufacturer to determine why the device had stopped functioning during the critical hours when rescue operations had been attempting to locate the couple. The investigation had revealed that extreme cold and moisture had caused battery performance degradation that had not been adequately addressed in the device's design specifications. Equipment reliability in extreme conditions remains a critical factor in wilderness emergency response, the manufacturer's engineering report had concluded. Design improvements are being implemented to ensure consistent performance at temperatures down to -20 degrees Fahrenheit with exposure to blowing snow and ice. James Rodriguez had continued leading search and rescue operations throughout Glacier National Park, but the McKinney incident had profoundly affected his approach to emergency response planning and risk assessment. His recommendations for improved wilderness safety protocols had been adopted throughout the National Park Service system and had influenced emergency response procedures in wilderness areas throughout North America. Every incident teaches us something about the limits of human preparedness when confronted with the raw power of nature, Rodriguez had written in a professional journal article about wilderness emergency response. Our responsibility is to learn from these tragedies and use that knowledge to prevent similar incidents in the future. The couple's families had established an annual wilderness safety symposium that brought together researchers, emergency responders, and outdoor enthusiasts to share knowledge about bear behavior, weather prediction, emergency communication, and survival techniques. The Daniel and Sarah McKinney Memorial Symposium had become a premier educational event that had directly contributed to improved safety outcomes for thousands of wilderness visitors. Jennifer Patterson, Sarah's sister, had become a passionate advocate for wilderness safety education following the tragedy that had claimed her sister's life. Her presentations at schools, outdoor organizations, and emergency response training programs had emphasized the importance of understanding that proper equipment and careful planning could not eliminate all risks associated with wilderness travel. Sarah loved the outdoors and understood that adventures involve inherent risks, Jennifer had told audiences during her safety presentations. Her message would be that those risks can be managed and minimized through education, preparation, and respect for the power of nature, but they can never be eliminated entirely. Michael McKinney, Daniel's brother, had established a scholarship fund supporting wildlife photography students who demonstrated commitment to ethical wildlife interaction and habitat conservation. The scholarship requirements had included training in bear safety, wilderness emergency response, and the techniques necessary to photograph wildlife without disturbing natural behaviors or creating dangerous situations. Daniel's passion was capturing the beauty of wildlife while maintaining the distance and respect that kept both photographer and subject safe. Michael had explained during the scholarship program's launch ceremony. His legacy should be about promoting responsible wildlife photography that contributes to conservation rather than creating unnecessary risks. The investigation into the incident had also revealed gaps in the integration between wildlife research and visitor safety programs that had contributed to the tragic outcome. Bear 417's radio collar data had provided detailed information about its location and behavior patterns, but this information had not been effectively incorporated into the permit approval process that had allowed the McKinneys to camp in an area where bear activity was known to be occurring. Information sharing between research programs and visitor services needs fundamental improvement, the official investigation report had concluded. Real-time wildlife tracking data should inform permit decisions, trail closures, and emergency response planning to prevent future human-wildlife conflicts. The changes implemented following the McKinney tragedy had included requirements for all winter backcountry permits to include bear activity briefings, mandatory carry requirements for satellite communication devices, enhanced emergency equipment standards, and improved coordination between wildlife research and visitor safety programs. These changes had already prevented several potential tragedies by providing earlier warning of dangerous conditions and better emergency response capabilities. Dr. Thompson had continued his grizzly bear research with renewed focus on understanding the behavioral changes that appeared to be occurring as climate change disrupted traditional patterns of denning, feeding, and territorial behavior. His work had contributed to improved prediction models for human-wildlife conflicts and had influenced management decisions throughout bear habitat areas in North America. The McKinney incident represents a new type of human-wildlife conflict that reflects the changing conditions we face as climate disrupts ecosystem patterns that have remained stable for thousands of years, Dr. Thompson had written in his comprehensive analysis of the incident. Our management approaches need to evolve to address these new realities. The memorial service for Daniel and Sarah McKinney had been held at the Whitefish Mountain Lodge, where they had spent their final evening before entering the wilderness. Attended by family members, friends, Park Service personnel, and members of the outdoor community who had been deeply affected by their story. The service had emphasized their love of adventure, their commitment to each other, and their respect for the natural world that had ultimately claimed their lives. They died doing something they loved, in a place they found beautiful, facing challenges that they met together, the memorial service officiant had said. Their legacy is not the tragedy that ended their lives, but the love they shared and the inspiration they provide for others to appreciate the beauty and power of the natural world. The remote ravine where their bodies had been discovered had been designated as a restricted area, closed to public access, while natural processes restored the site and wildlife patterns returned to normal, following the intensive recovery operations and media attention that had followed the incident. Park Service officials had indicated that the area would eventually be reopened to experienced backcountry travelers, but with enhanced safety requirements and monitoring systems. This location will always be associated with tragedy, but it remains part of the wilderness ecosystem that Daniel and Sarah loved, Ranger Williams had explained during the area closure announcement. When appropriate, it will again be available to visitors who share their appreciation for wild places and understand the responsibilities that come with wilderness travel. The story of Daniel and Sarah McKinney's final adventure had been featured in outdoor magazines, wilderness safety publications, and documentary films that had examined the complex factors that had contributed to their deaths. These accounts had consistently emphasized that their tragedy had resulted from an unprecedented combination of circumstances rather than any single mistake or oversight in their planning and preparation. The McKinney incident demonstrates that wilderness travel involves inherent risks that cannot be completely eliminated through equipment, training, or planning, one documentary narrator had concluded. Their story is not a cautionary tale about avoiding the outdoors, but rather a reminder that wilderness experiences require constant vigilance, respect for natural forces, and acceptance that some risks remain beyond human control. The improved safety protocols implemented following their deaths had been credited with preventing numerous similar incidents throughout the National Park Service system, saving lives and reducing the number of emergency rescue operations required during dangerous weather conditions. The enhanced communication requirements, improved weather monitoring, and better integration of wildlife data had created a comprehensive safety net that had already proven its effectiveness during multiple emergency situations. Their deaths have meaning because the lessons learned have prevented other families from experiencing similar tragedies, Jennifer Patterson had said during a visit to the memorial plaque installed at the Whitefish Mountain Lodge. Sarah would be proud that her story has helped keep other people safe while pursuing the adventures that make life meaningful. The Daniel and Sarah McKinney Memorial Trail Safety Program had been established as a permanent feature of visitor education throughout Glacier National Park, providing comprehensive training in wilderness safety, bear awareness, emergency procedures, and weather assessment for thousands of visitors each year. The program had been recognized as a national model for wilderness safety education and had been replicated in national parks throughout North America. Education remains our most effective tool for preventing wilderness tragedies, the program coordinator had explained during its 5th anniversary ceremony. Daniel and Sarah's story provides a powerful foundation for helping people understand both the rewards and responsibilities of wilderness travel. The bear spray that had temporarily saved their lives during the initial encounter had been analyzed by manufacturers and emergency response specialists to determine its effectiveness under extreme weather conditions and to develop improved formulations that would remain effective despite wind, cold, and moisture. The research conducted following the incident had led to enhanced bear spray designs that had proven more reliable in challenging environmental conditions. The McKinney incident provided valuable data about bear spray performance in extreme conditions, the manufacturer's research director had reported. Product improvements based on this analysis have enhanced the effectiveness of bear spray as a wilderness safety tool throughout North America. The Apgar Ridge Trail, where they had planned to complete their honeymoon adventure, had been modified to include additional emergency shelter locations, enhanced communication relay points, and improved trail markers that would assist navigation during low visibility conditions. These improvements had been funded through donations collected in memory of the McKinneys and had already assisted numerous hikers who had encountered unexpected difficulties on the challenging mountain route. Trail improvements ensure that future visitors have better options for dealing with emergency situations, the trail maintenance supervisor had explained during the dedication ceremony for the enhanced facilities. Daniel and Sarah's legacy includes tangible improvements that will serve wilderness travelers for decades to come. The investigation's final report had been released exactly 1 year after the incident, concluding that the tragedy had resulted from an unprecedented combination of factors including climate-disrupted wildlife behavior, extreme weather conditions, and the inherent limitations of emergency response capabilities in remote wilderness areas. The report had made recommendations for improved safety protocols, while acknowledging that wilderness travel would always involve risks that could not be completely eliminated. The McKinney incident represents a complex case study in wilderness safety that demonstrates both the effectiveness of proper preparation and the limitations of human control over natural forces, the investigation chairman had concluded. Their story should inspire continued improvement in safety protocols while maintaining recognition that wilderness experiences involve inherent risks that must be accepted by those who choose to seek adventure in wild places. The annual Memorial Symposium had become a significant event in the wilderness safety community, attracting researchers, emergency responders, and outdoor enthusiasts from throughout North America, who gathered to share knowledge and honor the memory of 2 people whose deaths had contributed to improved safety for countless others. The symposium proceedings had been published annually and had become essential reading for wilderness safety professionals throughout the world. Daniel and Sarah's legacy lives on through the knowledge shared at this symposium and the lives saved through improved wilderness safety practices, the symposium director had said during the opening ceremony of the 5th annual event. Their story reminds us that wilderness adventures require constant learning, careful preparation, and deep respect for the power of natural forces. Ndim, the remote wilderness area where they had died, had gradually returned to its natural state following the intensive recovery operations and media attention that had followed the tragedy. Wildlife had resumed normal patterns, the damaged campsite had been restored through natural processes, and the area had once again become the pristine wilderness that had originally attracted them to plan their honeymoon adventure there. Nature has healed the immediate impacts of the incident and the recovery operations, Dr. Thompson had reported during a follow-up study of the area 2 years after the tragedy. Wildlife behavior has returned to normal patterns, and the ecosystem shows no lasting effects from the human activity associated with the emergency response. The lessons learned from the McKinney incident had been incorporated into wilderness safety curricula at universities, outdoor education programs, and emergency response training centers throughout North America. Their story had become a standard case study for examining the complex factors that could contribute to wilderness emergencies and the importance of comprehensive preparation for dealing with multiple simultaneous challenges. The McKinney case provides an excellent example of how multiple factors can combine to create emergency situations that exceed the ability of even well-prepared individuals to manage successfully. A wilderness safety textbook had explained. Their experience demonstrates the importance of understanding that proper preparation reduces risk, but cannot eliminate it entirely. 5 years after their deaths, the Daniel and Sarah McKinney Memorial Fund had contributed to wilderness safety improvements throughout the National Park Service system, supporting research, education, and equipment development that had enhanced safety for millions of wilderness visitors. The fund's impact had extended far beyond the specific location where they had died, creating lasting improvements in wilderness safety practices throughout North America. Their memorial fund has created a positive legacy that extends far beyond the tragedy that inspired its creation, the fund administrator had reported during the 5th anniversary review. Daniel and Sarah's deaths have contributed to safety improvements that have prevented numerous other wilderness tragedies and enhanced the safety of outdoor adventures for millions of people. The couple's families had found some measure of peace in knowing that their deaths had contributed to improved safety for others who shared their love of wilderness adventure. The memorial programs, safety improvements, and educational initiatives established in their honor had created a positive legacy that had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. We can never bring Daniel and Sarah back, but their story has prevented other families from experiencing similar losses, Michael McKinney had said during a memorial service marking the 5th anniversary of their deaths. Their love of adventure and respect for nature continues to inspire others to pursue outdoor experiences while maintaining the safety awareness that they would have wanted for everyone who follows in their footsteps. The wilderness where they had died remained a place of extraordinary beauty and continuing adventure for those who approached it with proper preparation, appropriate respect, and full understanding of the risks involved. The enhanced safety protocols and improved emergency response capabilities that had resulted from their tragedy had made wilderness travel safer without diminishing the sense of adventure and connection with nature that had originally drawn them to seek their honeymoon experience in the mountains of Montana. The wilderness that claimed Daniel and Sarah's lives remains a place of incredible beauty and meaningful adventure, Ranger Williams had written in her final report on the incident. Their legacy ensures that future visitors can pursue similar experiences with enhanced safety while maintaining the spirit of adventure and respect for nature that they embodied throughout their final journey together.